Great. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started here at 8:49. And I want to thank everybody for calling in or Zooming in today and joining us for our agenda. And I do want to thank everyone for your patience. We do have some of these things we have to work our way through as we meet together separately. So we're going to open the meeting at this time. And as we do, it's been our habit to pause and remember that DEQ's mission is to be a leader in restoring, maintaining, and enhancing the quality of Oregon's air, land, and water. And so we have some of that business to take care of today. And as we begin, I do also want to just pause and remember the Oregonians that are struggling with this very difficult sickness that's come to our community. And not everyone has been untouched by this. There are many families out there, Oregon families, that have been touched and that are hurting. And so just our thoughts go to them. At a time like this, when we're all thinking about staying healthy, what better time to work on keeping our environment healthy. So with that, let's begin. Commissioners, you've had an opportunity to review the agenda. Director, yourself as well. Are we aware of any amendments to our agenda we need to make at the top of our meeting? Hearing none, we'll accept the agenda as presented while reserving the right to maybe adjust it slightly as we go. We will also let the record show that all the commissioners are present, if virtually. And so with that, I think we are ready to get underway with our first item of the day, which is the Vehicle Inspection Program fees.
If I may, Chair George, to introduce this item for the record, this is Richard Whitman, DEQ Director. We have three presenters this morning: Ali Mirzakalili, who's our Air Division Administrator; Mike Skorupka, who's the Manager of Vehicle Inspection Program; and Karen Williams. This is what we are asking the Commission to do here is to reaffirm a decision you made in November of 2019. And without going into all the details why we're asking for you to do that, it has to do with the fact that the Oregon Legislative Assembly ended in kind of an unusual way this past session. And that created some uncertainty about the legal status of the rule that you adopted last fall, which was to go into effect on, I believe, April 1st. So that's just a little bit of background for the rulemaking. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ali to kick it off.
Good morning, Ali.
Let me go ahead. I see Ali. Let me unmute Ali. Okay, so hang on. So most of Ali should be unmuted. Ali, go ahead. We can hear you. Yep.
Can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me now?
We hear you well, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Like I said, this is for the record. I'm Ali Mirzakalili, Division of Air Quality Administrator. Director Whitman stole most of my thunder here introducing the topic. I just want to check to make sure Mike Skorupka is on the phone. He was also having troubles connecting. And Karen Williams, I believe she is on. So I'm going to, if Mike acknowledges his presence, I'm going to turn it over to him.
If Mike is on the phone, does anyone know his number so I can make sure he's unmuted? Just the last 4 digits of his number.
Mike can also press *9 to raise his hand.
Oh, I'm so glad you're handling this part of it, Commissioner Barrasso.
Okay, he's unmuted.
Good morning, this is Mike Skorupka. Can you hear me?
Good morning, we hear you great.
Great. So following up on Richard and Ali's introduction, today we are asking you to approve a temporary rule to increase the cost of a certificate of compliance issued from DEQ's vehicle inspection program. We're also asking that you reaffirm a finding that the vehicle inspection program is cost effective. We have presented on the vehicle inspection program, as was mentioned 3 times in the past, and appreciate the Commission's approval of DEQ's recommended rule revisions and fee increase proposal in November of last year. The fee increase received recommendations to pass from 2 legislative committees, but ultimately the 2020 legislature failed to ratify the fee increase. While statute allows agencies to increase fees at any time, if the legislature does not take action to ratify the increase before it adjourns sine die, then the fee reverts back to its previous amount. Given the unique circumstances surrounding the end of the 2020 short session, the status of the Commission's previously approved fee increase is somewhat unclear. Out of an abundance of caution and under guidance from DOJ, we are asking the Commission to reaffirm the increase via this temporary rulemaking. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen Williams, if I may.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Karen Williams, Chair George, Vice Chair Barascio, and Commissioners, and I am an air quality planner. And if we are on the second slide, please. Today, this presentation will cover DEQ's rationale for seeking a temporary rule and the justification that without that temporary rule, there would be serious harm to the public or affected parties. So we will review the following items with the Commission: the purpose of the vehicle inspection program, a short explanation of the recent rulemaking status that brought us to this point, a short description of the program status during the COVID-19 pandemic, the situation that creates a need for this temporary rule, the justification for the temporary rule, an acknowledgement of the 2019 cost effectiveness analysis and its findings, and DEQ's recommendation to the Commission to adopt the temporary rule and reaffirm VIP's cost effectiveness. And if we could move to the third slide, please. So as we've presented to the Commission over the past year, the vehicle inspection program ensures that vehicle pollution control systems are functioning properly. Passing vehicles receive a certificate of compliance that is required to renew their vehicle's registration every 2 years in the Portland and Medford areas. At 7 facilities, VIP performs about 1.3 million tests per biennium on light and heavy duty gasoline vehicles and on passenger diesel vehicles. And VIP also issues certificates through on-site dealership testing and through a partnership with about 150 businesses that have devices that transmit data to DEQ for analysis. And if we could go to the fourth slide, please. In 2018 and 2019, DEQ undertook rulemaking to revise and update language in OAR 340-256, which included a proposal to increase the fee for a certificate of compliance. DEQ undertook the public rulemaking process, convening a fiscal advisory committee in October of 2018, and holding public hearings and comment through January of 2019. DEQ wished to obtain legislative approval for the fee increase before presenting to the EQC, but we did not receive that approval in the 2019 legislature. When that fee increase was not approved, VIP eliminated 8 positions in June of 2019. The legislature at that time also requested an expanded cost effectiveness analysis, which DEQ completed and submitted in October of 2019. The EQC then adopted the proposed rules, including the fee increase, in November of 2019, but DEQ at that time did not submit the rules to the Secretary of State for effectiveness because we sought legislative ratification in 2020 of the fee increase before doing so. During the February 2020 legislative session, the Joint Natural Resources Subcommittee and the Joint Ways and Means Committee recommended passage of DEQ budget items, which included the VIP fee increase, but unfortunately the legislature failed to act on that ratification, as Mike Ali and Richard have alluded to. And as Program Manager Mike Skorupka introduced, Oregon Statute 291-055 allows agencies to increase fees at any time. However, if the legislature does not take action to ratify the increase before it adjourns, then the fee increase is considered rescinded. Because the status of that fee increase that the EQC did approve in November is unclear, we're asking the Commission to reaffirm its decision via this temporary rulemaking. And I will now hand the presentation back to Mike Skorupka.
In just a moment,
Thank you.
so I've gotten a comment here that says, can you please share your screen so that we can see the slides? So I don't know if it's, the slides of course are all available on the website. They can be pulled up live, but I don't know if that's an option we have to share the screen with the participants so that they can follow along that way.
Richard, do you know if Stephanie was able to connect?
Stephanie has not been able to connect, and she's actually gone to a different location where she thinks she can connect from. So
what I'll do is I'll pull down the slides and I'll share the screen then.
that would be great. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Okay,
Thank
I'll
you
do that in a
very
minute.
So please
With
go
that,
ahead.
this is
Yeah.
Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
I'll continue with, should I continue with slide 5?
Please do.
Thank you. In early March of this year, the Oregon governor issued an order requiring Oregonians to stay home except for essential needs and closing certain businesses to slow the spread of COVID-19. The DEQ director closed VIP clean air stations on March 17, 2020 to protect the health of employees and the public. Stations remain closed through at least May 17th. Through EQC and DEQ director orders, certain vehicle owners with expiring registrations during station closures may delay their vehicle inspection until December 31st of this year. These vehicle owners do have alternative means to have their vehicles tested or to purchase their certificates of compliance. They may visit a DEQ2 participating location for testing and certificate payment, or they may purchase their certificate online with an agreement to bring their vehicle in for testing by the end of the calendar year. When stations do reopen, DEQ expects higher than normal testing volume, perhaps as high as 35% increase, as motorists who deferred their emission tests from March through May join those motorists whose vehicle registrations expire in the second half of 2020.
Hey,
Proceeding to slide 6.
Hey, Mike, this is Greg Addington. Chair, can I ask a question?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Hey, Mike, can you just walk me through the payment part? So if somebody comes in either online or through the DEQ2, do they pay a fee at that point in time and then agree to come back at the end of before the end of the year?
That's correct, Commissioner. The payment system is based on the DEQ2 online technology, so that same functionality has been reconfigured so that the certificates can be purchased for the COVID purposes separate from DEQ2, but same approach with respect to the fee, that there is the fee that is paid to DEQ for our administration of those programs, and then for DEQ2 private sector participants, those participants can elect to charge a fee on their own in addition to the fee that we charge.
And then just, so if somebody does the DEQ2, pays a fee to DEQ2, that, do they have to pay again when the end of the year when they come back?
No, they would just pay at the time of completing the transaction. So with the DEQ2 private sector testing approach, the test is obviously performed at that time. Then the fees are paid online. They can also complete the online process to get the tags in the mail. If the alternative approach is used to, in effect, purchase a certificate of compliance from a VIP test station now, that payment is complete at this time. and then the individual would return to the station by the end of the calendar year to receive their test from us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Proceeding to slide 6, the need for the temporary rule to increase the fee for a certificate of compliance is the same as for a permanent rule presented to Commission November of 2019. Expenses in VIP have been increasing in the past several biennia, largely due to the increase in personnel costs, wages, medical insurance costs, and other benefits. The current fees sustain the program only through June 2019, and that was with the program's careful spending, use of ending balances, and incorporation of new technology. But the need is even more urgent now as the program faces reduced revenue from station closures. April revenue was approximately 10% of a normal month. Please recall that VIP is entirely fee-funded and receives no general fund support. The program needs to rebuild staffing to maintain customer service and must rebuild its fund balance to meet ongoing expenses. With slide 7, DEQ has found the temporary rule is justified because without the fee increase, affected parties would be substantially harmed. Affected parties include not only DEQ and VIP employees in particular, but also vehicle owners and businesses in the VIP areas, as well as the general public. Before the recent closures, VIP was performing the most tests per year per FTE that it ever had. Staffing had not increased to meet the demand, but with innovations, the program was able to maintain short customer wait times and very high approval ratings. The program had filled 7 of 8 positions eliminated in 2019 with limited duration appointments, anticipating a 2020 fee increase ratification. But DEQ had to eliminate those 7 positions in April of this year. VIP also is holding 4 additional positions vacant at this time. Reduced staffing in the stations threatens the high level of customer service that VIP has always been able to maintain. Without a fee increase, VIP may have to close lanes at stations or even an entire station and may be understaffed to meet essential program needs, especially given the higher testing volumes expected when the stations reopen, as well as increased wait times for customers. Traffic line backups onto adjacent roadways may create an inconvenient or even unsafe situation for motorists. The temporary rule, specifically a fee increase, would allow VIP to rebuild the program's depleted fund balances and begin to rebuild staffing. On slide 8, we address the fee structure. The biennial fee increase that DEQ has proposed is as follows. Portland, a $4 increase to $25. Medford-Ashland, a $5 increase to $15. Mobile on-site dealer testing fee, a $4 increase to $30 per certificate. These increased fees would become effective on June 1, 2020. And note this is the same fee structure as the Commission approved in November 2019 for the current biennium. On slide 9, regarding the cost effectiveness findings, DEQ appreciates the Commission's affirmation in November that VIP is a cost-effective program that achieves Clean Air Act requirements. Today, we remind the Commission of the key findings from the cost effectiveness analysis that DEQ completed last year. Oregon statutes 468A-400 and 468A-370 provide that before establishing fees, the Commission shall determine the most cost-effective program consistent with the Clean Air Act requirements, and that the EQC shall determine if the most cost-effective method of conducting a motor vehicle inspection control system inspection program is being utilized. Overall, from the cost-effectiveness study, DEQ drew 3 primary conclusions directly related to cost-effectiveness. First, Oregon's election to utilize a centralized or publicly run program directly benefits VIP customers. Public programs charge customers on average significantly less than a privately run program. Also, the use of the centralized model avoids the monitoring and compliance issues that exist when private sector garages provide both testing and repair services. Second, Oregon's fees, which are approximately 1/3 of those charged by the privatized programs are among the lowest in the nation. Our fees are even lower when considering that retests are free and that the program receives no general fund support. Third, VIP provides several key services that other programs do not, such as remote testing, customer self-service lane options, and on-site testing services to businesses with large vehicle fleets. A copy of the full cost effectiveness report was in the Commission's November 2019 information packet. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen to address slide 10.
Thank you, Mike. So we hope, Commissioners, that this presentation was helpful in explaining the need and the justification for this temporary rule. The rule we propose now is temporary, so we can respond to the urgency of VIP's current situation. However, as we presented to the Commission last year, the need for VIP's fee increase is not temporary. Later this year, DEQ will bring the Commission proposed permanent rules that will include the fee increase as well as the language changes and the updates that the Commission considered last year. So with that, at this time, DEQ recommends that the Environmental Quality Commission determine that failure to act promptly would result in serious prejudice to the public interest or the interests of the affected parties for the reasons that were stated in the justification section of the staff report for this item. Adopt a temporary rule as proposed in attachment A of the staff report for this item as part of Chapter 340, Division 256 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, and to reaffirm the Commission's November 2019 finding that in accordance with ORS 468A 400 and ORS 468A 370, that the vehicle inspection program, including the proposed 2020 fee increase, is the most cost-effective program consistent with Clean Air Act requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Commissioners, do you have comments or questions about the presentation? Commissioner Barrasso.
Thank you, and appreciate this, and appreciate the reminder about this. I guess the question I just had is when you talk about coming back to the Commission later this year for the permanent rule approval, is there, I know that part of the reasons that the legislature did not sort of get finished with their business and did not get to take action. Is there an expectation that the legislature would come back and take action in one of their interim legislative days, such that this could, just how does that play? How do we connect with that?
So if I could, Chair George, this is for the record, this is Richard Whitman, DEQ Director. We don't know if the legislature is going to come back in special session or not. If they do, it's possible that they could consider a fee ratification bill. We may not be the only agency in this situation. And however, I think our expectation at this point is that this issue would be taken up and this was, so thank you for your question, and I actually wanted to clarify this for the Commission and actually for the record also. We will be coming back to the Commission for a permanent rulemaking this fall. And then after that, the legislature will need to ratify the fee increase. And for the record, if the legislature were not ratify the fee increase in the next session, then the fee would revert back down to its current levels. So just for the record, to make all that clear.
It's good clarification. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none from our commissioners, then I think we are ready to entertain a motion in regard to this agenda item. Does anyone care to offer a motion on this?
So this is Molly Kyle for the record. And I move that the Oregon Department of the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission determined that a failure to act promptly would result in serious prejudice to the public interest or the interests of the affected parties as presented in the justification section of the staff report for this item. That we reaffirm the finding that in accordance with ORS 468A 400 and ORS 468A-370, the vehicle inspection program, including the proposed 2020 fee increase, is the most cost-effective program consistent with Clean Air Act requirements. And that we adopt the temporary rules as seen in attachment A of the staff report as part of Chapter 340, Division 256 of the Oregon Administrative Rules to be effective June 1st, 2020.
Well said. That was an impressive motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. For the record, we will have a roll call vote. Please indicate your vote by voting yes or no. Commissioner Brasso.
Yes.
Commissioner Kyle.
Yes.
Commissioner Addington.
Madam Chair, I'm going to vote yes on this, but I do have a comment, and I don't know if it's appropriate right now or.
Let's complete our vote, and then we'd be happy to give you a little time to make your comment.
Thanks.
So just for the record, that's a yes from Commissioner Addington. That's correct?
Yes.
And Commissioner Mosby.
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes. And Commissioner Addington, we'll go to you.
I know this has been before us before, and I understand what's happening here with the need to do this. But I just, I think I said on our special meeting a couple of weeks ago, I just think we've got a slate of fee increases on the agenda for this meeting. And I think we just have to be cognizant of what's going on around us right now. And the fact that, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, people are struggling all over this state right now. And, it just looks like, I think the optics of this is we're just out here raising fees and with oblivious to what's going on. So I just want to say that's kind of on my mind a little bit with what's going on right now. I'm not super comfortable. I understand timing is what it is, but I just want to put that on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We appreciate that. And I think it is worth saying that it is kind of a difficult juxtaposition of actions at this time. We do have some fee increases that we have to take care of. And I think it's not lost on any of us that this is a really difficult time. And if we didn't have to, we wish we could avoid this at this time. So I think your points are well made, and thank you for them. All right, with that, we probably should move forward to our next action item. This is the Air Contaminant Discharge Program fee increase proposal.
And Chair George, again, for the record, this is Richard Whitman, DEQ Director. I'm going to provide just a few introductory remarks here and then again turn it over to Ali Mirzakhalili and his team to present the specifics. I want to do an introduction to this item, and it actually pertains to the other fee increase rulemaking that you have before you today, which is for several water quality permit programs. Here's I say, because and this is really responsive to Commissioner Addington's remarks, which I don't want this to sound defensive, but I want you to know what we've been thinking about in terms of the impacts of these fee increases and a little bit about steps that we've taken to reduce those impacts on fee payers. So for both this air quality permit program and the water quality permit program, these fee increases were worked through with stakeholders really a year and a half ago in preparation for the 2019 legislative session. They were considered and debated in the 2019 legislature and approved as part of DEQ's budget. The last step in the process is for the commission to work out the details within that budget approval of the legislature in terms of in terms of the fee increases, and we were scheduled to come to you in March at the regular commission meeting in March with these 2 fee increases. We postponed that with the COVID situation emerging quite rapidly at that point. And since that time, we've been, along with everybody else in the nation and world, kind of watching what's been happening with both the public health situation and our economy. The staff reports for these 2 fee increase rulemakings got to you a little bit late. And the reason they got to you a little bit late is because I asked each of the programs to look at specifically what can we do to reduce the impact of or avoid these fee increases right now, given the economic situation in the state. And both programs have modified what we were planning to bring to you in March to reduce those impacts. And the main element of that is, there are several pieces that I'll let the programs describe, but the main element is to phase in these fee increases over a much longer period of time, so that they're not hitting everybody all at once, and also so that we maintain the predictability of the fees so people can plan for them, which is what we've heard from stakeholders is really very important to them. So I want you to know we have been sharpening our pencils and trying to figure out what we can do to reduce these. Related to that, we are also, and you'll hear more about this later, going through planning right now for budget reductions here at DEQ. And these changes that we're proposing to make and the fees that come to you will have some budget impact on the agency. I just want you to know we understand what's going on in our communities around the state. We're doing our very best to be very mindful and thoughtful about that as we bring proposals to you. So we can get into more detailed questions in the presentations, but I just wanted to provide that context.
Thank you, Director. I do think it is important for us to have that context as we go forward, that really every effort is being made to be aware of the challenging times that we're in. Stephanie Caldera, I believe you had your hand raised. Stephanie, did you have something you needed to share with us at this time?
Thank you, Chair George. This is Stephanie Caldera, your EQC assistant. I have rejoined the meeting, but at this time am unable to run the slides. So for this item B, if either Director Whitman or Vice Chair Barrasso could run the slides, and then at the end of this item, I'm going to attempt to re-sign in as the host from a different location. So thank you all for your patience and bearing with our technology this morning.
Thank you, Stephanie, for working so hard to deal with all this technology. We really appreciate it. All right, Commissioner Barrasso, you've been doing a fine job. Are you up to the task?
I think so. Just to make sure you all see the next set of slides, and are there any blockings on that slide? Does it look like anything's covering it?
Not from my vantage point. They look just great.
Great.
All right, with that, we'll turn it over for the staff presentation.
Chair George, can you hear me?
I hear you. Yes. Go ahead, Adi.
Thank you. Director Whitman, thank you for setting the stage. Chair George, Commissioners, again, for the record, this is Ali Mirzakali, the Air Quality Administrator, and we are here to seek approval of new fees for the state air permitting program known as ACDP, or Air Contaminant Discharge Permit Program. We will present the details of this fee rulemaking, which followed the legislative approval of DEQ's 2019-2021 budget, as Director Whitman stated earlier. The proposed fees will bring the program up to a funding level over the next 2 biennia sufficient to cover the cost of 6 authorized FTE for the ACDP program. Though this rulemaking began before the dramatic disruption to the public health and economy caused by the COVID-19 outbreak, EEQ recognizes the outbreak may affect some regulated entities' ability to pay increased fees. With me here is Dan DeFer, who is a staff person in our operations team, who will provide more information on the implementation of these proposed rules in light of the pandemic. We also have Melinda Mahoney from our budget analyst is also here and available for any questions regarding DEQ's budget and fee proposal, as is Jacqueline Palermo, the operations manager overseeing this rulemaking. If you move to the next slide, I just want to quickly introduce the agenda topic. We'll begin with a brief overview of the ACDP program, cover past and proposed fee increases, describe some of the public input received, describe the small business impact mitigation efforts, including a new basic air contaminant discharge permit fee, and close with a, if you have any questions, and our recommendations to the Commission. With that, I will turn it over to Dan, who hopefully is audio capability. Dan?
Yes, I think I'm audio capable. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Thanks, Ali. Hello, Chair George, Commissioners. Thank you. My name is Dan DeFer in the Air Operations section of DEQ. And so if you go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So this is a high-level breakdown of the types of air contaminant discharge permits DEQ issues. To clarify, ACDPs are state-level operating permits that are issued or assigned to sources that are not subject to a federal Title V operating permit. This rulemaking is to address ACDP fees, and we are not proposing to alter any Title V annual or emission fees which are conducted in their own rulemaking, or alter any Clean Air Oregon related fees. On this slide, you'll see a few examples of sources which are for which each permit type typically applies. So the most simplest permit issued by DEQ is the Basic ACDP. It applies to the smallest emitters, contains only the most significant applicable rules. Next is the General ACDP, which is issued to an industry or operation type as a whole. These are usually also relatively small emitters. The permits are issued after a public notice period and cannot be edited or modified for source-specific situations when they apply for it. Next is the Simple ACDP, which is written as a source-specific permit, but can be relatively simple to moderately complex depending on the source. Then the Standard ACDP, which is for more complex sources, medium emitters, and sources opting for an emissions limit to avoid Title V permitting. And next slide, please. And this is just a quick overview of the state with a pin, one of the blue pins showing each active air contaminant discharge permit to get a sense for where activities and operations subject to the program are located. And next slide, please. So the history of the program fee increases for context of this rulemaking is as follows. In 2008, there was a 20% increase to ACDP fees, and again in 2014. The 2014 increase was estimated to sustain the program through 2017. A fee increase proposal in 2017 did not receive approval, and DEQ eliminated 4 air positions to balance the budget. The ACDP program has lost full-time equivalent, or FTE, or positions consistently since the 2009-2011 biennium. This proposed increase will bring the program up to a sufficient level of funding over the next 2 biennia and cover the cost of slowly reestablishing 6 of the FTE that have been previously eliminated. And next slide, please. So we're proposing a fee increase following the legislative approval, as referenced earlier, of Policy Option Package 116 in the 2019 legislature for DEQ's 2019-2021 budget. The Policy Option Package, or POP, is DEQ's proposed budget to the legislature. Once approved, the legislature then establishes spending limitations for the agency. This was done in House Bill 5017, which establishes DEQ spending limitations while accounting for the increased fee revenue and positions expected from the POP approval. DEQ's policy option package to the legislature included the following description in part. This package includes 8 permanent positions that are phased in to coincide with the fee increase to the ACDP program. The 8 positions are specifically to address the air quality permitting backlog that a 2018 Secretary of State audit found. 6 of the positions are permit writers funded through ACDP fee increases, and 2 positions are for Title V work funded with Title V revenue. The package also assumes an ACDP fee increase in order to generate about $3.1 million in revenue in 2019-2021. This fee increase is anticipated to be around 70% increase and would be sufficient for the next 2 biennia. The current projected 2019-2021 ending fund balance for the program is negative without a fee increase. The Legislative Fiscal Office recommendation to the legislature was to approve this package. This legislative approval authorized DEQ to increase ACDP fee revenue for general sustainment of the program, as well as the 6 additional positions over the next 2 biennia, and are to be phased in beginning on July 1st, 2020. The most straightforward way to raise this revenue was to establish a 70% increase to current annual fees across the board. A percent increase naturally takes into account the different fees applicable to more or less complex permit types. With 70% as a starting point, DEQ made changes to reduce the impact in a multitude of ways. And next slide, please. DEQ has balanced its vital obligation to enforce the law and protect public health with considerations of the dramatic disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. To lessen the economic impact to sources across Oregon, DEQ modified its recommendations to the EQC to phase in the annual fee increase over 3 years for most permittees. Additionally, annual invoices for all sources will clearly refer to the option for initiating a payment schedule and agreement or installment plan for fees. Sources that request to establish these plans can do so on a monthly basis without incurring late fees or interest. This change was determined to be appropriate given the impacts of COVID-19 and also aligned with public comments that requested a phased-in approach to the fee increase. This establishes a slower increase over the course of 3 years for approximately 87% of permit holders. This proposed approach to the fee increase is shown on the table here. DEQ's leadership's decision to provide fee relief has an additional result of needing to hire the approved FTE slower and/or later than anticipated. DEQ will need to phase in the approved positions at a slower rate, but is confident that the phased approach will not significantly hinder the permit backlog reduction efforts and that the benefit to businesses in the current climate warrants this change. And next slide, please. This and the next few slides will show the current and proposed fees. Current fee structure is shown via the lower portion of each column. The proposed increases are the alternate color and top portions of each column. This chart shows the source-specific permits that the program issues, which are the relatively simple basic ACDPs, and the more complex, simple, and standard ACDPs. For more detail, the staff report outlines the exact dollar figure increases, but on the right you will see types of activities subject to a basic ACDP and the associated permitting criteria. Generally speaking, the basic fee increase is implemented as a 15%, 15%, 20% increase over the next 3 years, and the other source-specific permit increases are proposed to be effective beginning this December. And next slide, please. This chart is the general ACDPs issued, and as a reminder, they are not source-specific, but rather cover an industry or activity type. Each one is assigned to a specific fee classification identified within Division 216. There are 6 separate fee classifications that cover 27 different general permits. The bottom of each column is the current fee with the alternate colors describing the total annual fee due each year, beginning with the light green due December 2020. So this is the 3-year phase-in that was referred to earlier. And next slide, please.
If you don't mind, I have a question.
Oh, of course.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair George. Can you describe how this would have looked prior to, how this chart would have looked prior to COVID?
Yes, thank you for the question, Commissioner. So the difference would have been, there would be no differentiation between the top 3 colors of those columns. The entire column would be due this December as an increased annual fee.
It's good clarification. Thank you.
So here is the annual fee structure for each permit type and fee class, including the approximate number of payees. These fees are based on Oregon administrative rules in Division 216, and you can see the fee revenue per permit type, current and proposed effective December 22 and forward. Please excuse the typo where it says December 2023. The phase-in would be December 2022 fees moving forwards would be the final increased amount proposed here. And note, because sources open, close, and reclassify based on their specific situations, the numbers here are approximate. And if there are no questions on that one, we can move to the next slide.
Don't see any.
And here are some specific activity fees which incur a fee per occurrence. The first batch of darker green on the left are initial permitting fees. The lighter green next are permit modification fees for existing permits, and the yellow are other permitting and or compliance related fees. A few notes for clarity, you'll notice that there are those two items that go off the chart, major new source review, standard ACDP, and the equivalent permit modification. They both go from $50,400 to $63,000. These are two of the most complex permitting actions that ACDP staff take on. These increases show approximately a 25% increase over current fees. The chart would have been significantly skewed and not shown as much detail, so please excuse the slight sloppiness of that slide. And we'll move to the next slide. And DEQ is proposing to obtain most of the revenue increase from annual fees due to the relative instability of specific activity fee revenue. Here, most of the specific activity fees with an approximate number of times DEQ has assessed the fee back to 2015. In addition to not being a dependable or consistent source of revenue, specific activity fees typically only account for about 9% of total fee revenue. And next slide, please. DEQ took some additional steps to ensure affected sources were provided adequate notice regarding the proposed fee increases. With the fall 2019 annual invoice, DEQ included a pink informational slip of paper that explained a fee increase rulemaking was likely going to be in effect for the next invoice cycle, and this provided directive for any source that wanted further information. The same language regarding a subsequent fee increase was included on the printed and mailed invoices as well. DEQ conducted an informal meeting with some stakeholders to obtain additional ideas on how to structure fee increases, and DEQ reached out to all ACDP sources with an informational email regarding the public notice and comment period. This was in addition to the standard Gov delivery service notification of the public comment period. DEQ provided an opportunity for comment through an open comment period and a public hearing. This is in addition to the legislature's proceedings that approved DEQ's policy option package and the spending authorization as previously discussed. 12 individuals, some on behalf of organizations, submitted comments to DEQ which addressed a number of different issues. Opposition to the increase within several comments prompted DEQ to further reduce the impact to small businesses by waiving the construction notification fee completely for basic and general ACDPs. As DEQ had already received legislative approval for a fee increase, DEQ specifically requested comments on alternate ways in which to raise revenue while minimizing the impacts to small businesses. 4 such alternatives were provided within the comments, and I'll describe those now. On the next slide, please. The first alternative proposed was to raise fees for new construction, generally referring to our specific activity fees. And as referenced earlier, the specific activity fees applicable for new construction are proposed to be raised, but given that the fees only account for about 9% of fee revenue, it is not feasible to increase these fees enough to significantly reduce the annual fee amounts. Additionally, DEQ is concerned that increasing these fees to a degree which significantly reduces the annual fee increase would deter business growth in general or possibly deter businesses from appropriately notifying DEQ of changes or construction activities. The second alternative proposed was to increase penalty amounts for violations of air quality requirements. The staff report provides some additional detail and clarification, but there's a statutory requirement that DEQ's assessed civil penalty funds must be provided to the state general fund and cannot be used to fund the program. The third alternative proposed was to modify basic and general ACDP permitting for auto body shops. And this alternative proposed in the comment did not provide an alternate scenario that would raise the required revenue, but addressed a fee and permitting issue that may inadvertently be incentivizing auto body shops to begin using hazardous air pollutant containing paints. This is the result of some industry changes over the past 12 years without changes to permitting requirements. In response to the comment, DEQ is discussing ways to review changes to auto body related permitting, and we would address this with a separate rulemaking in the future. The fourth alternative proposal was to establish a smaller and slower fee increase. DEQ agrees that a smaller, more frequently recurring fee increase is a preferable option to a large one-time fee increase. As referenced earlier, DEQ proposes to establish the fee increase for most permittees over 3 years. And while DEQ is committed to working with the legislature moving forward to determine if a set recurring fee increase can be approved for the program, DEQ's policy option package approval accounted for additional annual fee revenue as early as December 2020 to ensure funding is in place to hire the additional FTE. This requires DEQ to address funding needs much sooner than what a smaller percent increase over several years might allow. And next slide. The Rules Advisory Committee stressed the importance of minimizing the impact of small businesses, namely the basic ACDPs. Some public comments and the statewide impacts of COVID-19 led DEQ to further lessen the impact. Though the statutory definition of small business is sources that employ 50 or less staff, it is a difficult standard to use for many air permits, as the type of permit issued depends solely on the operation, activity, or pollutants, rather than the size of the operation itself or the number of employees. DEQ's small business mitigation efforts in total include the following adjustments to an annual fee increase across the board. The basic ACDP annual fee is proposed to increase 50% total. Basic and general permittees will see their increased annual fees phased in over 3 years. This slower increase should allow for sources to better budget for these changes. The non-technical permit modification fee of $432 is the most frequently incurred specific activity fee and is paid most often by sources that change ownership or change their name. Basic and general permittees are the most frequent payers of this fee, so it is proposed to not be raised. The Type 2 notification of intent to construct is applicable to construction or modification activities which meet criteria that is established within Division 210. These activities are ones that result in an emissions increase above what's called de minimis levels, but less than significant emission rates for pollutants. DEQ proposes to not assess this fee for basic or general permittees. The new basic ACDP category is proposed to be established for sources that meet criteria that ensure relatively simple operations can be permitted more efficiently and for less cost. It is important to note that this new basic ACDP category does not require any operation to obtain a permit that was not already required to do so. More details on the new permit are in the next slide, but these changes overall result in less fee revenue than expected. From a general budgeting perspective, the specific activity fee increases should assist the agency in mitigating the loss of revenue from what was expected from the previous legislative approval. And next slide. So there's kind of a lot of information on this slide, so bear with me. DEQ's permits, we permit sources based on the applicability under permitting categories from a table of activities and sources in Division 216. One listing under Section B of the table, number 85, is known as a type of catch-all for sources that are not otherwise on the list explicitly, but that have uncontrolled potential emissions above specific thresholds. Sources that fit into this permitting criteria must currently, at a minimum, get a simple ACDP. The current B85 language is the top box on the slide you see. DEQ proposes to take the relative simplicity of an operation and its regulatory requirements into account when determining what permit would appropriately regulate the source. The proposed language for the new basic ACDP category is included in the second text box here, condensed slightly. The full language is in the staff report, but the criteria generally looks to ensure the source isn't subject to other specific regulations, control devices don't need to be used, the source doesn't require source testing, and the emissions can be limited to below the B85 levels on the top box with simply an hours or production limitation. The intent here is to find a way to permit relatively simple sources in a much more efficient and cost-effective way. After initial consultation with the source and appropriate information gathering, the basic ACDP should be able to be issued in a matter of days compared to a simple ACDP, which can take weeks and sometimes months. And next slide, please. For additional context, this is the simple ACDP fee structure, current and proposed, when compared to the proposed fee for the new basic permit. As I said, under current permitting, a new, quote, B85 source is required to obtain at least a simple ACDP, and by rule, they have to pay the simple high fee initially on the left, and may be eligible to pay the simple low fee annually after that based on their actual emissions. As you can see, the lowest annual fee one of these sources could possibly pay under the current fee structure was $2,304 per year. The fees are proposed lower for the new basic because the permitting action, based on the criteria we proposed here, should be able to be accomplished by staff much faster and more efficiently. The majority of the regulatory work will be in determining applicability of the basic permit, and subsequently ensuring record keeping and reporting conditions can effectively verify compliance. And next slide.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair George. You're muted, but.
There we go. And actually, before you begin, Commissioner, I need to step away just briefly. So by all means, make your question or comment, and then the chair will be yours for a few minutes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I guess I just wanted to get clarity on this slide. We went through and there's a lot presented, so I would really just appreciate you almost in some ways explaining. So what I'm seeing here is the simple high fee, which is what would be initially charged for a simple permit, but on the high end. In subsequent years it would be the simple low, but now we have a new basic ACDP permit fee, and that's a new category, and that's lower than both of those. Is that what I'm hearing? I just want to make sure I understood that.
Yeah, that is correct, Commissioner. Thank you for the question. So the table of activities and sources is broken down into 3 parts, part A, B, and C. Activities and operations in part A of the table are eligible for a basic air contaminant discharge permit. So we're adding a listing to part A of that table, number 8. Currently goes 1 through 7, and number 8 specifies the criteria that was in the text box of the previous slide on the bottom half. So if a source looks at the table and says, I do these things, I meet these thresholds and these criteria, they would be eligible to apply for the basic air permit instead of a simple air permit.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. And just, do you have a sense for what percentage of those that would have applied for a simple air permit would now qualify for the basic ACDP permit?
So an initial review, I found a couple of sources. I didn't look through every single air permit, but there were, in an initial review, I found 3 sources that could potentially make the switch. But thank you for the question, Commissioner.
Okay, and just so I have 3 out of how many?
So simple. Simple ACDPs, there's a total of approximately 150 sources, and there would be some communication subsequent to this rulemaking, if that's the case, to communicate with all of those simple ACDP sources, maybe after some determining who might be applicable to that and who's definitely not applicable, to inform them of the potential to switch their permit type.
Thank you.
Sam or Kathleen?
Yes, go ahead, Commissioner Kyle.
So I have to admit, when I was reading through all this rule and all the things, all the different categories, and it did get muddy for me as to where increases were going and where mitigation attempts were being made. I think the slide previously, Sam, if you could back up one. Oh, maybe more. Keep going. Sorry, one more. Keep going. There we go. The one that actually had the, no, one forward one. There. So these are all the different activity types that have a permit. Is this, because there's a lot of things called simple low, simple high. You have simple permits, basic permits, new basic. There's a lot of categories here. Which ones were the attempt to make mitigation for COVID being applied? Where, you know, I just really got lost as to who's going to be impacted by these fee increases and how it got tailored.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner. So we have the most common specific activity fee. So let me break it down into the 2 buckets. You have the initial permitting and annual fees that exist for a source when they come into operation and then continue operation paying every year. And then you have the specific activity fees, which happen at a specific point in time when the source elects to do a certain construction activity or change in operation or something to that effect. So the annual fees for the basic are reduced overall Basic and general are phased in over 3 years. The non-technical permit modification fee is not going to be assessed when a source changes. And then the type 2 construction fee will be waived for basic and general ACDPs as well. So annual fee phase-in increase for 87% of the permittees. The quote-unquote name change fee or non-technical permit modification is not going to be raised at all. And then type 2 construction fees, which are relatively smaller projects that don't have a significant air emissions increase, won't be assessed a fee for basic and general permittees, the 87% of our sources as well. Did that provide any additional clarification? I'm sorry.
I think it's alphabet soup. And actually it was slide 10, Sam. I looked at mine. There we go. So these are all the different permit types that fall under the air contaminant, right?
Yes.
And the number of, the current fee, the number of people that have those permits, and then the revenue increases and everything else. So I think my question, breaking my question down a little bit, of those ACDP permit types, so in that column, which are the ones that you've attempted to mitigate based on the COVID crisis? I know all of them are being tiered in, but you said the new basic one is going to be eliminated?
So the phase-in applies to all of those categories, but the bottom 3. The top line, the basic ACDP line, is proposed to be a less of an increase overall. And the non-technical permit modification doesn't apply, fee doesn't get raised for anybody. The fee will just stay the same. And then the construction notification fee that is proposed would not apply to the top, would apply to none of them except the bottom 3.
So if I could, Chair George, this is
Director.
Yeah, let me try. I'm not gonna get into the details, but I'm gonna try to keep it at a little bit higher level in terms of the mitigation efforts. I think the main effort to mitigate the impacts has been in the basic and all of the 6 general categories. They've all moved from being increased over a 2-year period to being increased over a 3-year period. That's the biggest change that has been made to try to reduce the impact. So there are several other things that have been done to lower specific categories, but that's the biggest change. Does that help?
It does. And then what's the difference between a simple low and a simple high?
And for that, Chair George, I'm going to have to rely on Dan.
Yeah, good question, Chair George. Thank you. So when an initial source begins operation, they all have to pay simple high, that fee for a new facility. And then within Division 216, there are specific criteria that state which types of operations and activities are eligible to pay the simple low fee. So it's going to be specific emission limits. If you emit above a certain amount, you have to keep paying the simple high fee. And then if you're below those limits and you operate specific types of operations, then you can be eligible for the simple low, but it's very prescriptive.
Okay. And one more question, if you may, and it's kind of the larger way all of this connects. So we have just passed Cleaner Air Oregon, and we just passed the second phase of it, looking at the non-cancer risk. How does this permitting system connect with Cleaner Air Oregon and the risk, air toxic risks?
Good question, Commissioner. So I will say, generally speaking, the nexus between the Clean Air Oregon rules and what is proposed here is only the reference to what is called the fee classification of each permit. So when you see the general 1 through 6, those are all different fee classifications, classification 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the Clean Air Oregon fees reference the fee classification of your air permit to tell you which fees are applicable to which CAO requirements. So as far as the recent hazard index rulemaking, I don't believe there's a nexus other than the fact that somebody may have to change permit types potentially. But I'm not aware of anything specifically between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, if I may just expand on that just a little bit. If you recall, the way Clean Air Oregon is being implemented is through a call-in schedule. So the facilities get called in, and that program is funded through the fees that are collected under its own authority, and that's not subject of this rulemaking at all.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, and at the same time, we're all, wanting to understand how these various pieces of the regulatory pie, so to speak, fit together or don't. So thank you for that clarification. Okay, do we have any other questions or comments now? Okay, we're getting back to our place in the slide deck.
So the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So this is a brief explanation of the rulemaking process thus far, and if approved, the important fee-related dates moving forward. So initial discussions took place in September of last year with rules and fiscal advisory meetings in November and December. Draft rules were placed on public notice toward the end of January, and public hearing was at the end of February. If approved, specific activity fees will increase on July 1st, and the first annual invoicing cycle implementing the increase will begin in September. Sources would be required to pay these fees or establish an installment plan by December 1st to avoid late fees. And next slide, please. So aside from the previous questions, I'd like to stop here and provide an opportunity for any additional questions or to revisit any specific topics, or the next slide will proceed to DEQ's recommendation for the commission.
Chair George.
Yes, Commissioner Addington.
Thanks, Dan. And Richard, some of these might be for you or maybe Ollie. I just have a couple things. And first, I'll just reiterate again. I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with the amount of information and the interconnectedness of everything. The timing is bad. The economy is struggling. There's budget cuts coming. There's things like the corporate activities tax going on. And so all those things are sort of weighing on me. That being said, Richard, maybe you can help me first with I want to just at the very simplest level, make sure I understand the process here. And this is what I think, and you could please correct me where I'm wrong. The EQC or the department put a policy option package together, I think like in 2019 for the 2019 session that included this fee increase, I believe. And the legislature approved it. And now it's back to us to implement it. And if I'm right about that, this isn't whether or not we approve. It's not really whether or not we're going to do it. It's how we're going to do it. Am I right about that?
Director, you're on mute.
Thank you, Chair George, Commissioner Addington. So let me start with your first question, which was just to run through the overall process. Yes, this started with a policy option package proposed by the department actually in 2018. And if you want to go back even further, I think we also had a policy option package in 2017 for this. So this has been put before the legislature twice. In the 2019 legislative session, the legislature approved the policy option package, I think with some modification, if I remember generally. But they approved a policy option package increase for the ACDP program. That that authorized the agency to increase the fees. But you're right, the how part of it, exactly how that fee increase is distributed between the different permit categories and this phasing in piece are how pieces of that are now up to the commission and before you. But the legislature at a high level has approved the increase in fees. So it is a very lengthy process and not the simplest process.
Thanks. And Chair George, if I have just a couple more.
Sure.
I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the responsiveness to the comments and the things you mentioned earlier, Richard, about stretching it out over time, some of these fee increases. Could I just, Dan, maybe or Ollie, can you tell me how many air quality staff total are there and how many for this program?
Chair George, Commissioner Addington, we have roughly 30 permit writers, inspectors throughout the state. That's a combination of Title V and ACDP program that are engaged in this. As you know, we don't put them in different bins. They do all of those activities, combination of it. And including Clean Air Oregon even. So we have our permit writers become master of all of these disciplines.
Okay.
But to your earlier point as well, Commissioner Addington, I think we've struggled with the concept and the timing as well. This, as Director Whitman pointed out, this process began with a great deal of stakeholder outreach and involvement, and we actually put together our business case and what is the value-added proposition for getting the resources, and we have the support of stakeholders, and we understand that the landscape has changed since COVID-19. Also, so we're trying to be mindful of that and stage the fee increases over time. But also, I just want to, have to keep in mind that the recovery is also going to come, and with it will come the need for permitting and responsiveness of the agency, and we've got to be prepared to step up and be able to deliver services that are going to be asked of us during that transition. If there's a stimulus package that comes into us, that we have to be able to issue timely permits and be responsive to them. And the staff increases is necessary to maintain a program and allow us to deliver that level of service.
Thanks. And that, Ollie, that just my last point, that brings me right to it, which is, while I struggle with the timing and everything I mentioned, I also recognize the need for some certainty for businesses to move forward and to operate. And I just wonder if you could just touch on the permit backlog and where that's at and how you see this affecting it.
Chair George, Commissioner Addington, thank you for that question. That's the focus of our attention right now. As you know, the backlog has been something that's been weighing on on us and was the subject of Secretary of State audit. We've made great progress. We've put together a whole lot of streamlining procedures, and we are now providing a sort of target and statewide permit backlog reduction goals, but all of that is predicated on some increased level of resources for us to be successful. With the current staffing levels, it's really hard to get all of those jobs done because we're also getting we have inspection commitments that's done by the same staff, same permit writers, and recognize there's just limited number of hours to get everything done. So that is, we're committed to reducing and eliminating the backlog. I am working with regional administrators and our implementation administrator and Director Whitman and Deputy Director Feldman to devise a 5-year backlog elimination goal for us. But again, that's through some increased efficiencies and through some additional resources that will need to come to us.
Thank you.
Commissioner Barrasso, did you have a question? No? Okay. Anyone else with a question or comment?
I actually have a question.
Go ahead.
To follow up on Greg and Ollie's last comment, you mentioned all the processes that are going into play to reduce the air permit backlog, but I didn't really hear how many are in, if you could be a little more precise, when do you expect the backlog to be completed? Like when do you expect this program to be completed?
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, again, thank you. I didn't mean to skip that answer. We are currently about 40% overall backlog and over 40% of permits are backlog. And as you know, that permits are on a 5-year expiration. They can't, especially our major source permits cannot last more than 5 years. We have some permits that expire every 10 years. So every year that we renew permits, there are additional permits that expire. So it's a continued cycle that we have to repeat, and we've got to be able to do this. So at this point, we are, I think we need to increase our, we do have a plan to increase our permit processing renewal rate we need to do that by 30%, increase it by additional 30%. In order for us to be able to erode away at the backlog and get us down to maintain a level of that's near zero backlog permit. That's going to take some time. We haven't finalized those plans yet. Again, we've got to put this in with other priorities and align them appropriately. But that's the plan we're working on, and I think this year's backlog rate is around 20%, but by end of September will be around 20% backlog. But this is this year.
Okay. And some of those technical improvements in the processes in DEQ, again, it's kind of connecting programs and things that we've talked about over the years. How much of that is attached or a component of the EDMS systems?
George, Commissioner Call, thank you again. The EDMS will help us with the tracking and the streamlining and being able to troubleshoot. I think right now some of the metrics are not available to us. For instance, knowing what's the pinch point in our processes. You have to do a lot of discovery and interviews and talking to various staff to figure out what is causing our something to be stuck and it doesn't surface itself readily. We're developing tools in the interim. I'm not waiting for EDMS to be fully launched before we have that transparency developed. But that's one of the tools we're working on, and EDMS certainly will give us that. So where the processes are coming, how long does it take, where is it sitting, and what can we do to be more efficient. So that's the longer view when that's launched. In the meantime, we have conducted a few what we call a Kaizen exercises, look at the process improvements, identify and put in place some of those actions. Not everything has been implemented, but we're working on that.
And then one more question, if you will, because I have to admit with Greg and I think every other commissioner, this was a really depressing agenda. How much of an overlap is there between industries that are going to get hit perhaps with a price increase in this air, in their air contaminant emissions? And then in our next agenda item, we're talking about water permits. Are there, if you could speak to perhaps like on a Venn diagram kind of thing, overlap on industries that are going to get a back-to-back that fall under both of these agenda items?
George, Commissioner Kyle, I don't have an exact figure on that, but I'm sure there is overlap, and we're cognizant of that. This is the facilities that require permit, air quality permits typically have, other permits associated with them, and therefore the fees, will impact them, those facilities as well. Again, the discussions that we've had with the facilities have been, we haven't had joint conversations with water resources with the stakeholders, but we've had separate conversations with them and before this. I'm sure it's and I understand water program has also taken steps to try and mitigate their fee increases.
Director.
Yes, thank you, Chair George. Again, for the record, Richard Whitman. It's a great question, and I think what I would say, I don't have specific numbers either. However, what I would say is most of the folks who are that have federal individual NPDES permits for discharges for water quality probably are going to have an air permit. That's where you would see the biggest overlap. And I think for the other water permits, which are called WPCF, it's going to be a mix, but it's really that, and it's 200 and something odd individual NPDES permits, if I remember correctly. So that's where I think you would see the most overlap in fee payments between the water quality permit fees we're looking at and the air quality fees. A lot of the, let me put it this way, a lot of the very simple air permits are, if they have any water discharge, it's going to be into a publicly owned treatment work, and they don't require a water discharge permit from DEQ for that. So a lot of the large number of air permits for the basics and the generals probably do not have water quality permits. It's going to be the larger facilities that have both a water quality permit and an air quality permit. I hope that's helpful. It's qualitative, but give you some sense.
And then I did have, well, I had a lot more questions, but I'll keep it to one more. Why did you choose 3 years as the time frame for implementation? Did you look at maybe a longer time period because of the uncertainty that we're all facing right now?
So that again, Chair George, for the record, Richard Whitman, Commissioner Kyle, that was a judgment call on my part in terms of thinking about and trying to crystal ball that economic recovery right now is pretty difficult, but I think that the judgment was that 2 years seemed short, 3 years, looking at particularly the 07-08 Great Recession, what period of time it took for us to get into recovery. And then also another consideration was, how long has it been since there has been a fee increase at all in the program? And recall that for the AIR program, it's been 6 years since there was a fee increase. So it was weighing those things together.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Chair George?
Yes, Commissioner Mosby, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a question probably for Director Whitman. One of the things anecdotally we've seen in the past 2 months here, a lot of curtailment among heavy industry. Some of the aerospace producers, sawmills, plywood plants are curtailed. And we've seen a rail supplier shut down. And we're hearing that our air quality, at least the anecdotal stuff you see in the newspaper, we've seen reductions, and a lot of it obviously is from transportation, is down anywhere from 40 to 60% in the metro area. What, again, I hear Greg and Molly, I think these people are going to be very slow starting up. I guess, and I know you're going out 3 years here, but can you sort of tell us short term what DEQ is seeing as far as air quality and some of these contaminant discharge, into the air? Is there some way we could moderate these fee increases, at least short term, as these people start up slowly? I think in many cases, we've even had some steel companies, I think, have announced shutdown or curtailment. So I'd just sort of like a short-term look of the last 60 days, where we're looking, and your opinion, if you think these are going to start up, they're going to turn the switch back on the 1st of July or something. I just don't see that. I don't see the demand out there.
So Chair George, Commissioner Mosby, great question. And we have been thinking about this in terms of what we're seeing in the Oregon economy, in terms of what's slowing down, at what rate, where. And as a general matter, what we're seeing is, and a lot of this is I think fairly self-evident to folks, the retail sector in particular has been hit extremely hard by the COVID pandemic and the response to it. The manufacturing sector has been hit also, slower to take effect, and it's a mix of curtailments and shutdowns, in part to meet distancing requirements, in part because of slowdown in the economy generally. So the shape of the slowdown for manufacturing is a little bit different than it is for retail. So looking on the fee side, recall that these fees will go into effect in, I believe, October. They'll be due in December. So, and that will be the first third of roughly of the fee increase. So again, thinking about the timing of this and thinking about the impact on businesses toward the end of the year, we're looking at an impact of about a third of these increases. And then again, year 2, year 3. So again, this is trying to balance the fee increases with the impact on the businesses and the revenue that we are going to need to be ready when the economy, as the economy does come back. So that's our judgment at this point. There's no science to this. The situation is changing, rapidly, so it's very difficult. But we have been, getting what information we can regarding the specifics of the economy and what's slowing down where.
And Director Whitman, if I could just add to that as well, the existing rules that we have for air permits, they do allow for sources to enter a status called temporary closure, which allows them to pay a prorated annual fee amount, never to be less than half of their applicable annual fee. So for situations like this, for sources that have closed down, I don't know off the top of my head how many we have that have done that in light of this. I haven't ran any reports to that effect recently, but it's an option for sources that find themselves not operating right now, the emission units and conducting the activities that make them subject to an air permit. So that's an ongoing option that has been on the books for some years now.
Thanks.
So this is Molly.
Commissioner Kyle.
So the fee increases that are proposed here are to add 6 staff to the division for youth permit writers to deal with the demand, the backlog, correct?
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, yeah, is a general matter, although to some degree the fee increase also is covering just increase in cost in the program.
And this went before the legislature to get approval to hire 6 FTE. And that got lost in this session.
No, Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, the legislature did authorize those 6 additional positions, yes. Okay. It was, I think you may be thinking of the prior agenda item on vehicle inspection program. I sympathize.
I echo Greg. There was a lot of material to get through to prepare for this, this meeting. So these fee increases, though, are for staff in the program at a 6 FTE increase. It's not to hire new bodies. It's to just absorb and create and deal with the costs of the permitting, right?
No, Chair George and Commissioner Kyle, it is both to reflect increasing cost at our what's called our current service level, so existing staffing level, and to hire up to 6 additional positions for the program over a 3-year period.
And if I may, as I understand it, so and in addition to just the workload that's needed, but that's also in recognition of the permit backlog and DEQ's need to get on top of and show real progress in reducing that backlog is at least part of the demand, is my understanding. Is that right?
Chair George, that's correct. And again, that's it is in response to the real problem created by the backlog in terms of uncertainty for businesses that Commissioner Addington referred to. And it's also, we want to be responsive to the Secretary of State and their audit, and also some recent oversight that we have received from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency that raised some concerns about the air program as well.
I think it's important to have that context. Thank you. Commissioners, any other comments or questions?
And if there's nothing else, the next slide is DEQ's recommendation to the Commission.
Okay, well, we've had quite a bit of discussion, and these issues are complex, and they have a backstory that's important to keep in mind, as well as the reality of where we are today. So thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. Do we have any additional questions before a motion is considered? Well, we have the recommended language. Do we have a motion?
I just have another question, actually. It's for Richard.
Commissioner Kyle.
So you're saying that this would go into effect in the last quarter of this year? The fee increases on the regulated bodies?
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, that's correct.
Was there any discussion to just hold this year because of all of the uncertainty, just steady, and be able to postpone this to start in kind of a year's time? Just again, to give businesses, because I agree with Wade, I think the ramp up of all this is going to be slow. Because all these sectors, even though we look at them independently, there's a lot of interlapping functionality. So was there ever a discussion, or is there a possibility in front of the commission to think about that timeline as we are considering what is required to have a robust air permitting unit?
So, Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, it's a good question. And we did not think specifically about that sort of a pause to not have any increase this year. The one thing I would say about that is, since we have had 6 years of escalating costs in the program, and we had originally planned on this increase going into effect 2 years ago, if we were to not have any fee increase this year, I think there's a real possibility that in addition to other things going on that may affect staffing, that it would push us to have some staff reductions in the program in this year. So, another consideration here for me as the director is trying to, as best we can, and again, recognizing the tough economic times, be strategic about losing our underlying kind of core infrastructure for our programs. And so I haven't run the numbers on what it would look like. I haven't had staff run the numbers on what it would look like to not have any fee increase this year. But that would be a concern.
And Director Whitman, just to add to that, and we relied on Melinda Mahoney in running these numbers for us to establish, to make sure that we were covered. But my understanding is that if we didn't have an increase this year, your point holds true that we may end up in that situation. And additionally, the phase in, it wouldn't be just kind of delaying the phase in to next year, but the first year of fees next year would be a significantly higher initial year to not end up in a position where we're losing more staff. So it wouldn't be a simple delay of a year as much as a significant increase the following year. So brief discussion on that, but I think this option seemed a lot more palatable.
All right. Any additional questions? Okay, hearing none. Then it's time to see if any of the commissioners at this time wish to make a motion.
I'll go ahead and make the motion, Chair George. I'll make the motion that the Environmental Quality Commission adopt the proposed rules in Attachment A of the staff report as part of Chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, and approve incorporating these rule amendments into Oregon Clean Air Act State Implementation Plan under OAR 340-200-0040, and direct DEQ to submit the State Implementation Plan revision to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for approval.
Thank you. Do we have a second? I am not hearing a second, so I'm just going to give one more call to see if we have a second for the motion at this time. Hearing no second, we do not have You know, for the record, what would probably be best is if someone, commissioners, and forgive me for speculating here, but the lack of a second to me suggests that at this time, the motion as proposed before us does not have a majority of support, which is the role of a governing body to make those decisions. Director, is there any reason that for our administrative purposes, it might be worthwhile to go ahead and have a vote and have the motion fail? Or does it's simply enough to say that there was insufficient support to move forward with the motion?
So Chair George, I think it's enough to say that there wasn't support to move forward with the motion. The question in my mind is then what next? And I think there are a couple of alternatives that the commission could consider. One alternative is we do nothing and there's no fee increase. Another alternative is that we have an alternative motion now along the lines that Commissioner Kyle suggested. And a third option is that we bring this back to you in July with an alternate proposal, and perhaps with some more information about where we are with the economy, and in particular, but also our budget, because we are expecting more certainty around the budget a little bit later.
Yes, those were my thoughts as well. So in order of providing some order, that list of suggestions, my first thought is to hear from the commissioners if they have specific suggestions about what might make a motion now more palatable. And I see that Commissioner Mosby has some thoughts for us, so we'll go to him in just a second, that would allow us to take action today. And if they have thoughts about that, they could share them, and we could see whether or not those can be addressed either by you, Director, or by staff. So we could evaluate whether or not that's something that we would be comfortable proceeding with today. I think that would be the first step. And then if we do not have amendments that would allow us to proceed today, then let's get those issues on the table that might make action at a future meeting more palatable to a majority of the commissioners. So Commissioner Mosby.
Okay, I'm not against this. I hear what the EPA is saying, but I think that you're not going to see tremendous pressure from the EPA in light of what's going on around the U.S. Here's my thoughts. I think that we need to allow these industries time to get started up again, to get their employment back up. I think that right now, I think for the next year, I just don't see us getting to some of the air quality levels that we've had a year ago. So I would be comfortable if we move the start of this back to July 1st of 2021 and just moved it on out at that rate. That gives people time to get their employees back hired, hopefully restart and get their feet on the ground. It's strictly an economic issue, I think, among industrial users here. And quite frankly, as we get into things, water is more important to me right now. I think the air quality, we've plateaued and declined, and it's obviously because of there's a lot less manufacturing and transportation activity, but it's going to take a while to ramp back up, and we need to work with these people. So I would feel comfortable if we delayed it until, say, July 1st implementation next year.
Okay, we have a constructive suggestion here to essentially proceed with the type of changes that have been presented here, but to set a start date for the implementation of those of July 1st, 2021. I believe we've heard from staff that may cause some financial challenges and might result in the possibility of layoff in the short term. Director Whitman, this suggestion, is it one that would require some additional staff analysis and revision, and that could be brought back to the table at perhaps the next EQC meeting?
So for the record, Chair George, yeah, this is Richard Whitman. Yeah, I think that would be my recommendation to the commission also, is rather than doing something kind of on the fly here in terms of adjusting the motion, let us, I think we've heard the concerns from most of the commissioners about the timing of this. So let us go back and, as I said earlier, sharpen pencils one more time and think carefully about whether we could delay the effect of the fee further, particularly during the economic downturn. And at the same time, have you make a decision so that we have some certainty for the business community? Because I don't just want to kick this down the can, kick this can down the road indefinitely, because that creates its own problems for the regulated community. So my suggestion would be, let's bring this back in July with a with at least one option that postpones the fee increase.
And let me kind of take the temperature of the group here. Would this suggestion that the staff come back with a proposal that has to do with implementation of July 2021, would that you know, address the reluctance to proceed with the additional fee increases that are necessary to address the backlog? Would that put commissioners in a position where they might be more comfortable with proceeding? I just want us to make sure that if we're going to do additional work, we're going to sufficiently address the concerns. So can I get some indication from the other commissioners if that would address your concerns?
This is Molly. It would help me a lot. Also, you did reference some of the other kind of connecting issues with the permitting program, the audit, the agency, the federal components. Whether it's part of a July discussion or it's just a pre-briefing informational package, seeing how all of this connects is important to me. So having the ability to kind of do a deeper dive, perhaps just with Ollie or Dan, and I really do appreciate the presentation and the work that's gone into this so far. So this is not to negate the need at all. It's just really to make sure that we're never going to have certainty, but a little bit more time before we put something like this in motion would be helpful for me.
Yeah, and again, Chair George, I'm comfortable with the proposal. I just need to defer it. So as long as we get a deferment, allow these industries and manufacturers to get back on their feet, I would be very supportive.
Madam Chair, I appreciate all of this, and I agree with Wade and Molly, and think it would be better. I would throw out an additional thought, and I don't know if it's feasible or not, but just given the way things have changed in the last couple months, I wonder if there's any utility to getting the stakeholder group back together for a check-in as the department goes through sharpening the pencil, and just see, what all of them are thinking related to the situation right now, the need for permits, the economic situation, balancing those things.
Okay, go ahead, Director.
Thank you, Chair George. Just in response to Commissioner Addington, yeah, we have regular conversations with stakeholders, and we certainly will do at least a high-level check-in to get some input on this.
Okay, good. Well, I think we know the issue, really, that is the primary issue that is currently contributing to some reluctance, and we can do some additional work on that, bring it back to the table. All right, so at this time, we are behind schedule, but we've had some important conversations and we've had some technical difficulties, so we got off to a late start. At this time, it's been requested that we take a short 5-minute break. People might appreciate the opportunity to move around a little bit, and we're going to do some technical adjustments here. We had intended to have a break, but we wanted to finish up this agenda item. So let's see, it is now 10:38. why don't we all be back here at 10:45? Thank you.
And Chair George, this is Stephanie Caldera. You should all be seeing on your screen the first slide for greenhouse gas reporting and third-party verification 2019 rulemaking, just to verify that that is accurate for our commissioners.
Yes, we see it.
Thank you. I am now bringing in other staff who will be co-presenting through this, Elizabeth Elbell, and now I am also bringing in Lauren Slosky, so they should both be now co-hosts, and as well Corey Ann Wind should be co-host. All those three staff members should have the ability to unmute themselves as co-hosts now, and Director Whitman, Chair George, I believe we are ready to begin the next item.
Good, thank you. Director, do you have any introduction to this, or should we just jump in? Hearing none, go ahead and take it away, staff.
I think, Chair George, it's probably worth just making a note that this is item
Chair
C
George,
on the
this is
agenda.
Director Whitman for the record. We have a complicated IT situation between multiple locations here, but we are ready to go when you are.
Okay, great. And I think that was a good reminder.
You may be on
behalf
mute,
of our
Chair
Vice
George.
Chair. Oh.
No, I can hear Chair George just fine. I think Richard, you.
Richard, you cannot hear me?
I can hear you now.
Chair George, this is Colin McConaughey. Can you hear me as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Again, for the record, Chair George, members of the commission, my name is Colin McConaughey, and I'll be kicking things off.
Hold for a second. So, keep talking.
Okay.
Richard, one bit of feedback. It may be just worthwhile to call in via your phone, because you're getting all that feedback, because I assume two people are on computers, mics, and speakers in the same room close to each other. So that may just be one easy way for someone just to call on the phone.
Can you hear me when I speak now? Okay, I think we've solved our problem.
All right. I'm muted.
There's still lots of strange feedback.
Okay, how is this now?
Much better.
All right. Sorry about that. I start over here. Chair George, members of the commission, my name is Colin McConaughey, manager of the Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs here at DEQ, and I'm going to just kick things off real briefly here for our proposed changes to the greenhouse gas reporting rules, introduction of a new division requiring third-party verification for certain greenhouse gas reporters, as well as for our clean fuels program, and some adjustments to our enforcement division 12. So we can go to the next slide here. I'm going to move real quickly because I know we're short on time. So the goal of this rulemaking began early in the fall of last year, and we set out on this rulemaking to improve the specificity of how emissions are collected in our greenhouse gas reporting program, how those emissions are calculated by entities reporting into that program, and perhaps most significantly, how the data collected by that program are verified. And the reason for doing this was to primarily allow the program to better produce on the reasons for the program in the first place, which is to better support the evolving climate policy discussions that are happening in Oregon, that have been happening in recent years. And so, you know what, I'm just gonna leave it right there because I know we're very short on time. We'll just go to the next slide, and I'm gonna hand it over to Elizabeth Elbel to begin describing our proposed rulemaking package for you. Hopefully,
thank you, Colin. Are you guys all able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, commissioners. For the record, my name is Elizabeth Elbel, and I am the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program lead. We're going to share to you our process and the recommendations we're making for the rules that we are now proposing. To give you a little additional information, some of the guiding principles that helped us approach this rulemaking in a very thoughtful manner was to make sure that we were clarifying requirements in our rule, that we were relying on established methodologies and practices for greenhouse gas emissions reporting and accounting, that we were creating more transparency in the emissions calculations and the data that we're receiving, that we're being really consistent, and this is something we heard from our stakeholders, with the treatment across regulated entities within a single sector. When possible, we looked for areas where we could streamline processes and reporting so we could reduce reporting burdens and create efficiencies. We were very dedicated to incorporating stakeholder feedback into our rulemaking. And as Colin had mentioned, our goal really was to make sure we were collecting comprehensive state-level greenhouse gas emission data, and to ensure that this data that we're using to inform our policy and our greenhouse gas inventory is both accurate and verified. Stephanie, we can move to the next slide. So to give you an idea of the content of the changes that we're proposing, this scope of the rulemaking really focused on 4 main components. The first of those was taking advantage of the opportunity to streamline reporting between the Clean Fuels Program and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program for fuel suppliers that are subject to both of those. Additionally, we wanted to update Division 215 so that we could incorporate what had been in our existing guidance into our rule language, and make sure that we had more clarity in those requirements and certainty. We are also proposing third-party verification rules so that some of the information submitted to DEQ is verified by an independent third party. And then finally, to support all of these actions, we are proposing updates to our enforcement rules. And this is common practice when we amend or create new rules. So now I'm going to hand this off to Corianne Wynn to talk about some specifics of the Clean Fuels Program proposed amendments.
Yes, hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so good morning, commissioners. For the record, my name is Corianne Wynn, and I am the lead for the Oregon Clean Fuels Program. And so what I'm presenting today is the first part of the key sections that Elizabeth just pointed out. And this first part of the rulemaking addresses the issue that was identified by our regulated entities that are subject to both the Clean Fuels Program and the Greenhouse Gas Program. Basically, the question that was posed to DEQ was, why are reporting essentially the same information to 2 separate programs? And so we agreed with that statement, and we were looked into how we could streamline and make it more efficient for the parties in both programs. So Stephanie, next slide. And so in order to do so, what we had to do between Clean Fuels Program and Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program is to identify where the overlap in the requirements or the reporting requirements exist, and then which resulted in clarifying the language in Division 253, which are the Clean Fuels Program rules, in order to harmonize it with the language in Division 215, which are the greenhouse gas reporting rules. So essentially what that is to identify who the position holders are for transactions involving transportation fuels. And the position holders are basically the entities that own the fuel right before it's dispensed from a terminal into a truck. And so that was the common place. And so we had to then update the rules in Division 253 to make sure that they were consistent with 215. And so that's in our proposal. And then lastly, what we also needed to do was to modify our current reporting tool. In the Clean Fuels program, we call that the Clean Fuels CFP online system. And so we modified that tool to be able to accommodate its use for both programs. We've now renamed it the Oregon Fuels Reporting System. And so beginning with 2020 data, entities that supply transportation fuels will be able to report once into that Oregon Fuels Reporting System, and it will produce annual review reports for both the Clean Fuels Program and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. Any questions about this? Okay, so then I will hand the next slide over back to Elizabeth Elbel.
Thank you, Corianne. Okay, so here we are on slide 7. So DEQ's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program annually collects comprehensive greenhouse gas emission data from the state's largest sources of emissions. And this data is used to develop the statewide greenhouse gas inventory. So that allows us to track our progress towards our emission reduction goals and to look at trends in greenhouse gas emissions. This data is made available to the public, to our stakeholders, to legislators, and it supports current and proposed climate policy design and analysis. And that's why we feel it's very important to make sure that these rules allow us to collect this data and have certainty in the information that we do collect. So at a very high level, for Division 215, we did several things. One of those was to reorganize the rules to improve the way that they're read so that it's easier for our stakeholders and ourselves to understand the requirements. We went through and clarified requirements for reporting, for certification and submission, and eligibility for cessation of reporting. We did a lot of work to update definitions needed to support these rule amendments, and we did that in partnership with our stakeholders so that we had agreed upon definitions that we can rely on to interpret our rules. We did need to modify some of the reporting deadlines and record retention timelines. For example, we're now aligning the fuels reporting requirement deadline for the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program with the Clean Fuels Program. And then we added more specificity. So as we learn more about greenhouse gas emissions accounting, we know that there are additional data elements and best practices, and we incorporated those requirements into our rule. And a good example of that is for the reporting of biomass-derived fuels. Stephanie, we can go to the next slide. So the regulated entities that are impacted by this rulemaking and that are required to report into the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program are air contamination sources. So these are facilities that have air permits. We also require reporting by fuel suppliers, so those are both in-state production and importers. We require reporting by natural gas suppliers, so this would include natural gas utilities and interstate pipelines. And then finally, electricity suppliers. So this includes investor-owned utilities, consumer-owned utilities, and electricity service suppliers. And we can go to the next slide. Some of the proposed amendments to Division 215 impact the overarching reporting, as I presented earlier, while others of these are very specific to certain sectors, and I've highlighted a couple of those on this slide. For example, The amendments for the air contamination sources really focused on clarifying reporting requirements and adding several additional data elements that we realized were needed for our data analysis. So things like natural gas use, a little bit more specificity there, and electricity generation. And additionally, this reporting of biomass-derived fuels. For the fuel sector, as Corian described, we saw an opportunity to streamline, and so the rules there are really focused on making sure there's alignment between Division 215 and 253 to support that reporting. In the natural gas sector, we are requiring some new information. That includes information on the volume of gas going to large end users, so those would be large facilities in Oregon, identifying information for marketers operating on a natural gas system, information about biomethane. As we understand from our stakeholders, we may be seeing more biomethane coming into the state, and now these proposed rules have guidance on how to report that. And we're proposing a new requirement for reporting emissions from natural gas systems and pipelines. So those are emissions of methane that come out of the operation of pipelines systems. For the electricity sector, we worked closely with our stakeholders to create definitions of specified and unspecified power to improve the way that electricity is reported to DEQ. And we also have clarifying information on the emission factors that need to be used in that reporting. And then we also clarified information for third-party reporting, which is allowed for our consumer-owned utilities. Next slide, Stephanie. So to implement the proposed amendments, DEQ has a couple key elements in mind. One of those that we're working on is building program capacity. We're planning to hire additional technical staff for the greenhouse gas reporting program, and our existing staff for both the clean fuels and greenhouse gas reporting program are working on streamlining, excuse me, and developing the Oregon Fuels Reporting System, which is a modified version of the Clean Fuels tool. Additionally, our greenhouse gas reporting staff are working to transition all of our reporting requirements into DEQ's new electronic reporting system through the EDMS work. All of this is supported by our work in developing new guidance documents, developing webinars and trainings, and doing outreach and providing technical assistance to a regulated entity. And next we'll have Lauren Slosky talk about our proposal for third-party verification.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Can everyone hear me? Great. Good morning, commissioners. For the record, my name is Lauren Slosky, and I'm a climate change policy analyst with DEQ, and I'll be picking up here on slide 11. Since data reported to DEQ is used to inform significant statewide climate policy decisions and is used to assure that the Clean Fuels program is achieving mandated requirements, DEQ believes that considerable review and quality assurance is needed. Third-party verification is a proven mechanism to improve data reliability, identify areas of risk and opportunity, and decrease liability associated with incorrect data. This enhanced and independent data review of reported greenhouse gas emissions, credits and deficits, and other associated information as proposed in the new Division 272 rules will allow DEQ's programs to better support and track progress towards Oregon's climate goals and emissions reduction initiatives. For example, in the greenhouse gas reporting program, this would only impact a regulated entity such as a large industrial manufacturer or an electricity supplier that submits a report indicating these emissions were 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions or greater. Similarly, the Clean Fuels program verification requirements have several exclusions to minimize the burden on smaller businesses. I see that the slides have been taken down, so I hope you have your own version, and we'll be moving on to slide 12 now. The proposed Division 272 rules describe comprehensive requirements for regulated entities and verifiers seeking to perform verifications in Oregon. The rules also describe how these verification services must be performed and result in areas where DEQ has work to do too. So slide 12 touches on the key requirements by party implicated in the proposed rules. Responsible entities here means those that submit reports to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, Clean Fuels Program, or both, and that they are subject to the third-party verification requirements based on the thresholds previously described. In Division 272, these reporting or regulated entities or parties are referred to as responsible entities in order to differentiate them from the broader group of all of those who report to DEQ, but which may not be subject to these third-party verification requirements. The subset that is responsible entities will need to begin engaging services of verifiers starting in 2022 for data reported for the data year 2021 and then in each year thereafter. Division 272 also describes criteria for eligible verifiers to apply to, receive approval from, and maintain approval from DEQ in order to perform verification services here in Oregon. DEQ then needs to build out processes and resources to have a list of approved verifiers available by 2022 and continually thereafter so that responsible entities can contract with a verifier that they know is qualified to verify data specific to that sector or industry. Also, during any verification year, DEQ will need to review submitted materials, provide notifications as necessary, and also regularly provide technical assistance to responsible entities and verifiers as needed. So we'll move on to slide 13 to talk about next steps for third-party verification. Implementing this program will take time and requires that DEQ build out systems and processes that can support the training and approval of verifiers, allow responsible entities to contract and work with approved verifiers in an appropriate timeline, and also allow for timely review of submitted materials, such as the final verification statements due to the agency by the deadlines in rule once we are in a verification year, which again would begin in 2022 for 2021 data. In order to achieve all of this in time, DEQ will recruit a program administrator in the near term that will stand up the program and implement these requirements for both the Clean Fuels Program and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. So that concludes my review of the newly proposed third-party verification requirements. So we will move on to slide 14 to talk about the fourth item included in this rulemaking that Elizabeth had mentioned, which is updates to Division 12 enforcement. DEQ rules cannot be appropriately enforced unless they are classified within Division 12. Therefore, due to other rule amendments and new rules proposed of this rulemaking, DEQ is also proposing some amendments to Division 12. Consistent with other regulatory programs administered by DEQ, the proposed rules will classify certain violations and establish or clarify enforcement guidance for the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program of Division 215, the Clean Fuels Program of Division 253, and the newly proposed third-party verification requirements of Division 272. So on slide 15, and for the next couple of slides, we wanted to describe the process that we went through during this comprehensive rulemaking.
Just one moment, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, just to remind everybody who might be participating on the call that all the slides are available on the Oregon.gov DEQ EQC site, where our live agenda and all materials are provided there as well. So, if you can get another screen going, if you wish to, please feel free to go to that site, download the slides, they're all available there. Okay, back to you.
Thank you, Chair George. So picking up on slide 15, DEQ staff believe we have conducted a robust and inclusive rulemaking process here and wanted to describe this process over the next few slides. We convened a rulemaking advisory committee of 23 individuals and hosted 2 rules advisory meetings. In addition to these meetings, DEQ engaged in sector and topic-specific conversations with interested stakeholders. This allowed DEQ to provide clarifying information, answer questions on the proposed rules, and receive feedback. Prior to the formal public notice and comment period, we also held multiple written comment periods to receive feedback from advisory committee members, other interested stakeholders, and the public on earlier draft versions of the proposed rules. Finally, DEQ hosted a 40-day public comment period and 1 public hearing where no oral comments were received. Slide 16 describes a high-level overview of the fiscal impacts to regulated entities. The fiscal and economic impacts assessment conducted by DEQ was informed by DEQ analysis and stakeholder input. We made an effort to mitigate the fiscal impacts on small businesses by setting thresholds of applicability in the rules as previously described, in order to exclude most, if not all, small businesses that may have been impacted by new or amended requirements. DEQ provided multiple comment opportunities during the rulemaking process for stakeholders and advisory committee members to inform and provide feedback on the fiscal analysis. We also reached out directly to regulated entities and potential verifiers for estimated costs of third-party verification. In order to create a transparent analysis that was responsive to feedback, the fiscal impact statement included in the staff report that you've received is reflective of every response received by DEQ that included cost estimates. So then on slide 17, we'll provide a high-level overview of the key comments received throughout the rulemaking process. So again, in addition to opportunities throughout the process to provide comment to DEQ on the proposed rules and fiscal analysis, the formal public notice period was held for 40 days and included a public hearing. We received 18 individual written comments during that time and identified 85 different comment categories for response included in the staff report. The staff report provided to you includes responses to comments received during that time in attachment B. This, as I said, this slide shows a high-level overview of some key comments and responses from throughout the rulemaking process, with a focus on comments that resulted in changes we made to the proposed rules. For instance, DEQ pushed back dates for new requirements to begin later and reduced record-keeping timeframes in response to comments. We also aligned with existing practices in other jurisdictions, such as EPA thresholds and California definitions, in areas where it made sense to do so. Again, DEQ also included all cost estimates received in comments as part of the fiscal impact statement. So slide 18 basically concludes our overview. I and my colleagues Elizabeth Elbel, Corianne Wind, and Colin McConaughey are available to take any commissioners' questions prior to making a recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, do you have any comments or questions? I'm not seeing any. Director, did you have any further comments for us?
Chair George, I do not.
Okay. Yeah, Commissioner Kyle.
I just want to really commend Elizabeth on her presentation, despite distractions. So you did a great job. It was very clear, and it's really nice to see this program looking for efficiencies and the connections between different programs so that there is a lot more alignment in greenhouse gas reporting. So I just really appreciate that.
Agreed. You know, anytime we can make compliance easier for folks and better align our programs, it's something we commend. Commissioners, do you have any other comments or questions now? Yes, Commissioner Addington.
I echo that. I just also want to say that I just really appreciate. I try to pay attention to all the comments, and I just appreciate the responsiveness staff had to the comments.
Thank you. All right. Well, with hearing no more comments or questions, we are ready to entertain a motion.
Okay.
Stephanie, if you...
I move that the Environmental Quality Commission adopt the proposed rules and rule amendment in attachments A1 through A4 as part of Chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules.
We have a second?
This is
second.
I'll second.
Okay. Motion's been made and seconded. We will take a roll call vote. Commissioner Barrasso.
Yes.
Commissioner Kyle.
Sorry, the dog was barking in the background. Yes.
Commissioner Addington.
Yes.
And Commissioner Mosby.
Yes.
And the motion passes. All right. Thank you all very much. And we are going to proceed with our business. We next have an informational update item on the greenhouse gas emission reduction program. Agenda item D.
And commissioners, this is Stephanie Caldera, your EQC assistant. I'm going to adjust the co-host permissions, and we have had an issue with our screen sharing, so I apologize for this item. If folks can self-select these slides, we are working to ensure that we do not have further disruption through the screen sharing mechanism, but at this time that is unavailable. And so I believe Director Whitman, Colin McConaughey, and Michael Orman are the three presenters for this next item. I believe Director Whitman and Colin are present in the room, and Michael Orman, I believe you also have co-host permissions at this time, and so the three of you should be able to begin presenting on agenda item D today.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. We really appreciate all your great work today. And again, just a reminder for participants, if you want those slides yourself, you can find them on the DEQ EQC website. Okay, we'll turn it over to the presentation now.
Chair George, this is Richard Whitman, Director of DEQ.
You just muted yourself, Richard. And you do have feedback, which means there's another microphone that's picking up, whether it's your phone or in the computer. Or if you have a telecom. And you're doing great.
That's right. That's right. You know, we all need a little grace.
The kind of reports I like.
Leave it to Greg. Yes, sir.
Give me just a second to work with the audio here, and we'll try to get it fixed.
Absolutely, absolutely. We all need a little time and a little grace in these times. So you take the time that you need. Greg needs another cup of coffee anyway, right?
Very soon.
Here, George, while they're working on the audio, I just want to confirm you can hear me coming through.
Yes, Michael, we hear you, and we don't hear you with any strange effects.
Perfect.
Chair George, just doing another sound check here. Okay, we still have an issue. Hold on.
Okay, we will.
Chair George, let's try that again. Can you hear me?
Much better now, yes.
I think Stephanie needs to unmute my computer.
Actually, we hear you really well, Richard.
Director Whitman, your computer is unmuted and your line should be live at this time.
Oh, never mind.
All right, so let's give this a try. And We have three co-presenters on this item. Again, for the record, this is Richard Whitman, DEQ Director. I have with me Colin McConaughey, who's the Manager of the Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs at DEQ, and I'll talk about that office briefly. And we also have Michael Orman, who is our Air Planning Manager for DEQ as well. We are, I'll just note, a ways behind schedule. So we are going to walk through the presentation a little bit faster than we might normally, but I think this will probably take at least 45 minutes. So we are likely to go into our scheduled lunch break a little bit. Chair George, just heads up for you. With that, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to kick off the presentation, and then Colin will follow me in a bit here once we get into some more specifics. But I'm going to start out by laying out context for this effort. The purpose of the presentation today is to brief the Commission about direction that we have received from Oregon Governor Brown in Executive Order 20-04, which was issued in March, shortly after the end of the short legislative session. So to begin with, the state of Oregon has been working in the field of greenhouse gas reduction for some time now. Going back to 2007, the Oregon legislature that year enacted legislation that set goals for greenhouse gas reduction of at least 10% below 1990 levels by 2020, and at least 75% below 1990 levels by 2050. In the governor's executive order that was issued in March, she added a metric for 2035 of at least a 45% reduction below 1990 levels by 2035, and then updated the goal for 2050 for an 80% reduction instead of a 75% reduction. So for folks who are following on the slides, I'm now on the third slide in the presentation, which is the graph of greenhouse gas emissions trends in Oregon. Essentially, we are more or less flat in terms of how greenhouse gas emissions have done since 1990 in the state of Oregon. That means we are behind already on the legislative goal of a 10% reduction by 2020. So there's already a gap between where we are and where the legislature asked us to be. And we've seen some real trends in greenhouse gas emissions over the last 10-year period. We've seen greenhouse gas emissions from electricity go down as our electricity sector becomes cleaner and more reliant on renewable sources. But we've seen some other sectors go up to offset that. In particular, transportation greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon have increased. I'm now going to go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about the underpinnings of these goals. The goals are not just selected at random. They are levels of reduction that are necessary to keep global average temperatures from rising more than a range of between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. That doesn't sound like much. It's more in Fahrenheit than it is in centigrade. But the important point here is we're not talking about global averages. We're really talking about extremes, and extremes that are going to occur more frequently in particular parts of the year. So the scientists who have been analyzing changes in global average temperatures are seeing effects of temperature increases be greater in the mid-latitudes during the summer months in particular, and greater in polar regions during winter months. So although 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade actually translates to changes, now switching to Fahrenheit, of between 5.4 degrees and 7.2 degrees at mid-latitudes, the areas closer to the equator. So the point here being, the greenhouse gas reduction goals are what is needed for everybody to do in terms of greenhouse gas reductions in order for us to keep temperature increases from going above those levels that have uneven impacts around the globe. I do want to talk, bring it home a little bit to Oregon specifically in terms of climate impact. So the next series of slides, starting with the one that's titled Climate Impacts in Oregon, Snowpack and Hydrology, looks at projected changes in snowpack in Oregon and other western mountain ranges. And these are looking at both 2050 and then out to the end of the century at 2100. But even by 2150, at the higher end of the temperature modeling, we're looking at losing almost half of the snow water equivalent in our snowpack in the Cascades, and in the Klamath area, just over half of the snowpack. So very, very significant impacts, given that the snowpack is really how we store our water in Oregon. It's, rather than having large reservoir projects, we're very reliant on snowpack. The next piece I want to talk about briefly is wildfire. There's been quite a bit about wildfire, increase in incidence of wildfire in the media the last couple of years. The thing I want to, the figure that I find somewhat frightening has to do with something called return intervals. Return intervals are how often we see stand replacing fires that are intense enough that they really wipe out a forest. And in the Cascade range, we're looking at the return interval going from about an 80-year cycle down to as low as every 47 years by the end of this century. So again, some pretty severe changes. The next slide shows two maps. And again, this is fire intervals for the 20th century. And the black part of those maps are return intervals in the 80 to 100 year range. So big fire every 80 to 100 years. And that's kind of consistent with what we've seen in Western Oregon. What we would expect to see with temperature increases toward the upper end of those ranges is going down to big fire every 40 to 50 years instead of every 100 years. And that includes not just forest in the Cascades, it also includes large parts of the forest in our Oregon Coast Range, and then also down in the southwest part of the state. So Tillamook burn is a good example of a very large stand replacing fire. We would, under these projections, expect to see fires like that fairly routinely every 40 to 50 years in Western Oregon, if we're not successful in keeping temperature increases to the levels that the goals are set for. And then the final slide I have, almost the final slide, has 4 maps in it. And these are maps showing the distribution. Actually, what they show, again, at the higher level of temperature impacts, is the Douglas fir forest moving north and to some degree east, away from the coast over time, to the point where by 2090, very little of the Douglas fir forest that we currently think of as the iconic forest in Oregon remain. And instead, Canada is the beneficiary of Douglas fir moving north into the southern part of British Columbia. And the economic impacts of that to Oregon, our forest products industry, are quite concerning. So bottom line, in terms of climate impact concerns for Oregon, I've talked about wildfire. Obviously, that brings with it public health impacts, which we've seen too much of already in the last several years. It also means property damage in terms of fire and floods. I haven't talked about the impacts on our fisheries and our ocean fisheries, including shellfish and crab, impacts on water supply. A lot of these impacts will be on rural communities in Oregon that are resource dependent on water and that are also very exposed in terms of wildfire risk. So I wanted to provide that very quick overview of climate impacts just to set the stage a little bit for the governor's executive order. We hear about climate emergency. I think for the governor, we are in a climate emergency because of these risks that I've just done a quick run through, that we're running out of time to avoid the worst of those impacts hitting us. They won't hit us immediately, but if we don't start acting immediately to reduce greenhouse gas emissions along with everybody else, that's the future that we're looking at inevitably. So I'm going to pause there before I start talking a little bit about, give a very brief overview of the policy directives to DEQ in the executive order, and we'll transition to hearing from Colin McConaughey in a minute. So questions?
Commissioners, any thoughts right now? Not right now.
All right, thank you, Chair George. So I'm going to do the next slide, which is the intro slide, and then turn it over to Colin. There are 5 main areas of directives to DEQ in the governor's executive order. There are directives to many other agencies also, but I would say that a significant part of the actions that are called for in the executive order come to us, come to DEQ and EQC. And we'll talk a little bit later about the implications for workload for the EQC in terms of rulemaking. But first, let me just give an overview of the 5 directives. So the first is to expand and deepen the Clean Fuels Program. You just heard a little bit about the Clean Fuels Program. You'll hear a little bit more in this presentation about the success that we've already seen in the Clean Fuels Program, but the governor is asking you to extend the Clean Fuels Program beyond its current target of a 10% reduction by 2025 to a 20% reduction by 2030 and 25% reduction by 2035. That's the first element. The second element is a series of cap and reduce programs. First of all, for large stationary sources. Secondly, for transportation fuel suppliers. And third, for other liquid and gaseous fuels, including our natural gas sector. And you'll hear more about the details of those in a minute. The third element is to regulate methane emissions from landfills beyond the degree to which we already do. The fourth is to develop and implement strategies to prevent and recover food waste. About 40% of the food that leaves the farm is wasted between the time it leaves the farm and is consumed or not consumed. And then the fifth element is work with both at DEQ and jointly with other agencies to implement the statewide transportation strategy. So those are the big elements of the executive order. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colin McConaughey to talk about the first two elements.
Great. Thank you, Director Woodman. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right.
Well, we could.
To expand and deepen our clean fuels program and to cap and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from several sectors. So before I briefly go over our plan for how to implement the director's or the executive order's directive to expand the clean fuels program, I want to take a moment just to kind of herald some of the successes of that program to date. And just as a brief overview, this program is currently tasked with reducing the life cycle carbon intensity of Oregon's transportation fuels by 10% over 10 years, starting in 2015 through 2025. And so we're right square in the middle of that timeline. And so far, this program's reduced over 4 million tons of greenhouse gases, which is actually over 6% of the total statewide emissions as we traditionally account for them here in Oregon. And as a practical matter, in the market of this program, we have actually over compliance today, meaning that there's a bank of credits sitting there at nearly $750,000. And so there's some significant cushion currently in that market. Just a few other facts. The program has displaced over 900 million gallons of gasoline and diesel. These are fossil gasoline and fossil diesel with biofuels and electricity. And those biofuels, the ethanol, renewable diesel, biodiesel, they are actually themselves, those fuels are cleaner now as a result of this program than they were at the beginning, meaning that those fuels are being produced and delivered here in Oregon in ways that are cleaner throughout that life cycle of those fuels, how they're produced, delivered, and consumed here in Oregon. The biodiesel here being delivered now in Oregon is 34% cleaner over that life cycle than it was at the start in 2015, and ethanol is cleaner by 13%. And just one more fact here, less electricity being used in vehicles by our estimation to date has displaced over 12 million gallons of gasoline alone. So those are a few facts about the program, the Clean Fuels program as it is today. So with that, I'll go to slide 12 and just briefly share a tentative schedule that we have developed for how we will implement the governor's directives to the commission to expand the Clean Fuels program. And just to reiterate again, Director Woodman covered this, but currently the program is scoped to deliver a 10% reduction in the life cycle carbon intensity of transportation fuels over 10 years between 2015 and 2025. The directive in the governor's executive order to us is to accelerate post 2025 to double it in just another 5 years, 20% reduction by 2030, and then another 5% reduction to achieve 25% life cycle reduction by 2035. So that's the task at hand, and this schedule lays out our planned approach for that. We just minutes ago actually completed the first line there, which was the adoption of the greenhouse gas rulemaking, which includes third-party verification for clean fuels. We'll use the remainder of the year to develop that third-party verification program, developing guidance and trainings, approving verifiers before that verification gets underway. We'll be delivering, as requested by the governor, a report to her next Friday, May 15th, outlining how we plan, the schedule for how we plan to implement her directive in regards to clean fuels, and that this here is a preview of that. We'll go through some contracting to get a couple of studies underway. Study number one is we'll be looking at various scenarios of different fuel mixes and electricity that will show how Oregon's fuels market could achieve that ultimate 25% reduction by 2035. And the second study will be looking in particular at the tailpipe implications of that fuel mixture, how that will potentially affect localized health factors and the economic benefits of the health improvements by those cleaner fuels being used here in Oregon. And I skipped over row 5 there, which is our near-term rulemaking that we're planning to implement this kind of second directive of the governor, which is to specifically look at ways in which this program can accelerate transportation electrification, knowing that that's a key element to achieve our broader statewide greenhouse gas goals, as well as the specific targets of this program. So looking at a near-term rulemaking beginning mid this year, tentatively planned to conclude early next year, for ways that program can be modified to better incent electrification. And then going into next year, before we begin the rulemaking to adopt that 25% standard, we intend to go through a significant program review that will assess how this program is already operating, the economic implications of it, the fiscal implications of the program. With that program review concluding, we will then that will then kickstart the ultimate rulemaking to again adopt that 25% standard by 2035. And that rulemaking is planned to begin late next year and conclude the middle of 2022. And I'll just note that these, and if you're looking at slide 12, that schedule or Gantt chart there has a number of stars indicated. Those stars are indicate meetings at which public and stakeholder comment and involvement will be made available, and those are at a minimum. We may introduce additional opportunities. So with that, I'll move on to the second element that Richard mentioned. The second element being a directive to you and EQC to.
I have a question from Commissioner Barrasso.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll pause there and take questions on this first element.
I apologize for not catching that. Commissioner Barrasso.
I just wanted to know that 2 questions that are related. That 4 million ton reduction on slide 11 that you noted. When you say it's 6% of the state's emissions, is that 6% of the state's emissions in a given year, or state's emissions over that total time period that those reductions have been achieved?
Yeah, 4 million tons. Sheriff George, Commissioner Barrasso, good question. 4 million tons represents 6% of Oregon's annual emissions. So we annual emissions are about 65 million tons.
Got it. Great. Thank you. And then how does this 25% reduction goal, this going to 20 and then 25%, how does that compare? Obviously, I know that we're inextricably linked to California, and that they have a clean fuels program and compete for those same fuels. Just what are their goals? What are the signals they're sending?
George, Commissioner Barrasso, this compares similarly after 2030. This basically accelerates our program to achieve their program started 5 years earlier than ours, and so they're currently planning to achieve the 20% by 2030 already. And so this accelerates our program to align with that, and then goes further by extending it to another 5 years and another 5%.
Okay, so we catch up with them at 20%, and then we go further than them for another 5 years.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I move on to the second element on capping and reducing emissions in certain sectors?
Doesn't look like it.
All right. So again, the second element that Director Whitman mentioned earlier is a directive to EQC and DEQ to cap and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from some of the most important or significant sectors of emissions across Oregon County. And those three listed in the executive order are large stationary sources, transportation fuels, and then essentially all other fuels supplied in Oregon, both gaseous and liquid, calling out specifically including natural gas. So I don't have much information right now to share on how this program may or may not work. That is to be determined through a robust process we are will be proposing to the governor and to the public here in the May 15th report, also submitted next Friday. This report is as to how we will potentially implement this cap and reduce method is actually a preliminary one that we will submit again next Friday, May 15th. And we'll be taking comment on that report on a specific process and revising it pursuant to the feedback we get and submitting a final proposed process to implement this capital use directive to the governor June 30th. So going on to the next slide, slide 4.
If I could,
yes,
pause you, Colin. Chair George, just a little bit more comment on that. I know there is a high degree of interest out there in the public about the elements of particularly the cap and reduce programs that Colin just alluded to. And much of that interest is you know, is the agency going to propose things that are similar or the same as what the legislature was considering earlier this year during the March session, or similar to what the legislature considered the year before in the 2019 session. And I just want to say one thing about that for folks who are listening in, which is, and this will be addressed a little bit more in the May draft report to the governor, but we are in a different circumstance than the legislature was. We are constrained by the authorities that the legislature has given the agency and EQC in terms of policy development. So we cannot do everything that the legislature was looking at earlier this year. And that said, a lot of work has been done on greenhouse gas reduction programs in the legislature, although they haven't passed anything. So people should not expect to see things be exactly the same as what was being discussed in the legislature in terms of some of the discussion. Hopefully the report that comes out in May will make that a little bit clearer. But we are in a different world because we are not the legislature. We need to act within the bounds of what the legislature has given the agency already in terms of authority. So I wanted to say that just as an early note to folks who are following this closely. Colin?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. So just to pick things back up here in the slide deck, I'm on slide 14 for folks who are have that pulled up. I got a couple more slides here. This one here to describe what to expect in that May 15th report. And then a second one more specifically on the proposed process that you'll see outlined in that report. So there's really 4 sections that we plan for this report to the governor. And again, it's a preliminary one that we will finalize by the end of June. And the first is really a description from staff as to our understanding after consultation with counsel at DOJ as to the contours of the legal authority of the Environmental Quality Commission to cap and reduce greenhouse gas emissions as directed by the governor. And then a lengthier, is really the heart of the report again, is this proposed process that we are suggesting we will use to guide the development and ultimately the proposal to the Environmental Quality Commission for rules to implement this directive to cap and reduce emissions. And that's that central section of the report is what we will be soliciting comment on and revising for that June 30th final report. And then there's a third section that just a real brief and high level observation of what we expect to be some of the key policy design considerations, things that factors we need to be including all along the way, and what we can at this early point believe are the key policy options that we will be discussing with stakeholders in the public throughout that process. And then finally a brief fourth section expressly soliciting comment with some suggestions for specific things that we would ask folks to consider as a part of their comment to us on this proposed process. So I'm moving ahead to slide 15 here, and this is just again a preview of the proposed process. that you'll see outlined in much greater detail in this report next week. And that we structured this process into 3 phases. The first of which, at the point of this report being issued next week, we will essentially be starting phase 1, which is this engagement on the subsequent process, phases 2 and 3. And as proposed, we're calling phase 2 a scoping process. There's really actually no formal requirement or definition of how that is supposed to work. But we believe it's important to have a robust engagement process throughout the summer and fall before we get into the formal rulemaking process, so that we have opportunity for stakeholders and public to engage on a number of fronts to help us develop a proposal that's suitable to engage in that or enter into that formal rulemaking. And the timeline for that phase 3, the formal rulemaking, as proposed, will be late this year and throughout next year, including before the end of 2021, so that the program will be operable as directed to us in the executive order by January 1, 2022. And with that, I can take questions on the second element of cap and reviews before we move into the third one, which we'll cover on landfill methane.
Any quick questions or comments? Doesn't look like it. Oh, yes, we do. Commissioner Kyle.
This is important work, and it is sobering given the projections and everything else that Richard laid out. My question is really around that stakeholder engagement, and I realize the EQ or the DEQ has been appointed as the point agency, but how will you interact with other agencies that share responsibilities, and in particular, I'm thinking the transportation sector, and how, what's going to be the lines of communication or the liaison action with other agencies whose actions directly impact what will be going on with these rules?
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, for the record, this is Richard Whitman. Great question. And there's been a fair amount of work on that over the course of the last 6 weeks. Kristen Sheeran is the governor's climate and energy policy advisor, and she is essentially the convener, if you will, for that collaboration and coordination work between the agencies. So in the transportation sector in particular, we have been working for over 6 months now, actually dating back to last fall, with the Oregon Department of Transportation, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the Oregon Department of Energy on implementation of this statewide transportation strategy. You're going to hear about that a little bit more in the presentation, but we started meeting at the director and commission chair or vice chair level last fall to coordinate our work in that area. And we are continuing to meet on a regular, actually on a weekly basis right now at the director level between those agencies to talk about the transportation piece. We also have coordination work going on with other agencies. I'm going to mention one other one that is particularly important, and that's the Oregon Public Utilities Commission, where we're in regular communication and work coordinating our respective responsibilities to make sure they fit well together and that we're going in the same direction. So I think that answers your question, Commissioner Kyle.
Any others? Okay, let's keep going.
All right, with that, I'll do a check with Stephanie Caldera. Are we able to give Michael Orman access to present?
Yes, Director Whitman. Chair George, I believe Michael Orman can self-unmute for his part of the presentation.
Chair George, commissioners, can you hear me?
I can hear you great.
Great. For the record, my name is Michael Orman, and I serve as the Air Quality Planning Section Manager for Oregon DEQ. And I'll speak a bit now about Element 3 and the STS Element 5 before I hand the slides back over to Director Whitman. So back to element 3, we're on slide 16 now. As you know, landfills generate methane as wastes within the landfill decompose over time. There's some existing federal law that requires landfills of certain sizes to monitor methane generation and emissions and install gas collection systems when certain thresholds are met. The Executive Order 2004, which we're talking about, directs DEQ and the Commission to investigate regulations promulgated in neighboring states that reduce methane emissions from landfills and develop and establish the most stringent of those regulations in Oregon. And then next slide is a bit of timing here, which I need to provide a correction to, so that there's a typo here. Phase 1 should be removed. Our outreach in coordination with stakeholders will be conducted through the rulemaking process in this effort because of the focus of the activities. We will be providing an updated rulemaking plan in the draft May 15th report as required by the executive order. But we'll be conducting rulemaking on this effort over the next year about engaging with stakeholders in better understanding and researching the regulations that exist in our neighboring states and the work that we can do here in Oregon to further reduce emissions from these sources. It's very brief, but more work to come there. Any questions before I move on to element 4?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. I'll spend some time now talking about the statewide transportation strategy. Let's see, get my notes ready. Now I'm on slide 19, which covers a bit of the history of the statewide transportation strategy. Oregon first began statewide transportation strategy development in 2010 under the direction from the legislature in Senate Bill 1059. The goal of the effort was to make deep reduction in Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector to help the state meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals through actions taken by the Oregon Department of Transportation, the Oregon Department of Energy, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. The effort involved significant scenario modeling, stakeholder engagement, and program and policy development, and culminated in a statewide transportation strategy vision in 2013. Now on to slide 20. This slide represents some of the variables that were considered through this process as they modeled the different scenarios. And they include vehicles and fuels, pricing, systems and operations, transportation options, and land use. And the effort here was to better understand, as you make changes and reductions in different areas or establish different policies, how would that impact our transportation emissions over time as those policies went into effect. And then on to slide 21. This is an active slide in the presentation, so you won't be able to see the effect here, but what it does is gives you a sense of as the work was done to run these different scenarios. They ran over 200 different scenarios. It gave us an idea of where the low-hanging fruit was, so to speak, and some of the easier reductions and earlier reductions that could be made as you adjusted policies and programs that affected transportation emissions. But ultimately, what it came out to show is that we needed to make efforts and establish policies and programs in all of these areas to really get to the goals that had been established for us. Next slide, which is 22. This is the vision and roadmap. So in 2018, ODOT completed a review of Oregon's progress towards our STS goals, the statewide transportation strategy. The report concluded that while some progress was made, significant changes would need to be established in order to meet the vision of STS. And you can see in the graph here that some sectors reduced over time, but others grew. And the trends that we were seeing for 2050 were showing that some significant progress needed to be made to meet the vision. slide 23, the monitoring report. So the gap between the STS vision and reality identified in the 2018 review is summarized on this slide. Programs and policies were identified to make continued progress in these areas to close the gaps. And this too is an active, or the next one is an active slide that I'll cover as well. But you can see on the line graph here that we're not projected to meet our current STS vision per the monitoring report. Slide 24, this too is an active slide, and it was meant to show some of the areas that were focused in for potential improvements as part of the monitoring review. And you'll see here the list of various programs that could be established and worked on. Some of those have already been completed, and I'll note EV rebate, the Clean Fuels program, the employee commute option, work on transit. A lot of this work has been ongoing, but significant improvements need to be made in order to meet our goals. And so as Director Whitman mentioned, slide 25 now, Governor Brown had requested the 4 directors of the agencies to begin work on implementing the statewide transportation strategy. And again, it's included in the executive order to complete that work. Staff and directors have been meeting over the past months and are working on a plan to implement and make progress towards the vision of STS. And the executive order requires an updated plan to the governor on June 30th and ongoing outreach and updates to the governor throughout the process. And we'll be coming to you over time as we continue our coordination and collaboration on this work, and to seek your feedback and input on these policy and programs as we move them forward. Questions on element 4?
Doesn't look like we have questions.
Okay.
Oh, hold on, Commissioner Brasso.
Great.
This is, I'm actually going back. I felt like I held on this question on element 3. So for just folks, this is really slides 16, 17. Would that, just to get a sense on, I guess, can you, based on sort of, I mean, I know that there's been at least a cursory review of what our neighboring states are doing around methane emissions. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a sense for like what does that actually mean? I just want to ground myself, and like I hear that, I don't, and I at least, I certainly know element 2 has even more question marks around that, and that we'll tease that out. But what does that really mean with element 3? Are we, yeah, how far off are we? What kind of actions does that imply? I'm just looking for a little bit more of a flavor on what those actions look like. And I get that may not, yeah.
George, Commissioner Barrasso, I'll take a stab at that at a high level. Michael Orman can clean up any inaccuracies that come from my remarks. But as a general matter, we've looked at our neighboring states in terms of their regulations. We want to do a little bit more detailed and careful analysis, but it does appear that California's regulations are the most stringent. The California regulations set a action level for further improvements to methane collection systems if methane levels exceed a certain amount at a landfill. And we've done a very preliminary look at some of the solid waste landfills in Oregon, particularly the larger ones. And, you know, it would appear that those regulations would require improvements at, I'm going to say a few of the Oregon landfills beyond what they currently have in place, but it's not, that's obviously a key piece that we're going to be looking at. There are existing federal requirements, as Michael mentioned, that most of these landfills do have methane capture systems in place that they're operating already. We also need to look more carefully at Washington's regulations. I think in terms of Idaho and Nevada, they're probably not going to be the driving force here. It's probably the California regulations that we think will be most applicable. One other thing I'll mention that is probably of interest to folks is part of the early scoping around this issue will also be alternative compliance pathways. So we are looking at the potential for, and this would be a choice on the part of the regulated entity, the landfill operator, whether if there are additional equipment or systems to put in place, they could do that, or potentially take other actions to reduce methane emissions through other actions. That could be, for instance, contracts to reduce putrescible waste that is coming into the landfill. So at the upstream end, rather than through a technology-based approach. We think that will be part of the scoping discussion that we have here with the regulated community, all aimed at getting to the same levels of methane reduction that California is achieving. I hope that helps a little bit. Michael, if I could, Chair George, just see if Michael Orman has anything to add.
Chair George, commissioners, nothing else to add there. Thank you, Director.
Commissioner Barrasso?
And then I do have a question to the current STS slides. One of the pieces you mentioned there is pricing as one of the things. How does that connect to element 2 and transportation fuels and the clean fuels program? Like I know all of those touch on transportation sector, and to whatever extent at a high level you all can draw those connections, it certainly helped me understand.
Sure, Chair George, Vice Chair Barrasso, I think I can take that one. The pricing that's referred to in the context of the statewide transportation strategy is actually focused primarily on pricing around vehicle movement. So it's tolling, it's congestion pricing, it's those pieces of altering behavior around travel rather than pricing of fuels, which is what to some degree is affected by the Clean Fuels Program or potentially affected by the Transportation Fuel Cap and Reduce Program. There are other pricing strategies. Pricing of parking is something that I know the City of Portland has worked on, but that would be another type of pricing to again affect vehicle use.
Okay, thank you.
So, Chair George, there's one last piece of this presentation which I'm going to handle, and that is to talk a little bit about reduction of food waste. I mentioned at the beginning that 40% of our food, this is after it leaves the farm, is wasted in the distribution, processing, and consumption patterns of how we manage waste generally. So why does this come up in the greenhouse gas context? It comes up because of the large energy cost in producing food, in distributing food, in cooking food. So that to the extent we can reduce wasted food, it has essentially multiplier benefits because of all the energy inputs that go into handling food. So in analyses of programs that get the biggest bang for the buck for cost of greenhouse gas reduction, reducing food waste often comes up very high in terms of cost effectiveness. So Oregon, along with California, Washington, British Columbia, have been working in this area collectively through the Pacific Coast Collaborative with, and this is important to emphasize, with the food products industry and grocers and restaurants, really in a collaborative way around non-regulatory programs for reducing food waste. This is around, are there changes in our systems that can be made that are actually provide cost savings to producers? Are there educational efforts that we can do with grocery stores, with restaurants, with households about reduction of food waste? And so our materials management program has been active in this area. It's part of our 2050 vision for materials management, and that program is continuing to work with these associations on what are the next steps, what are the next things we can do to reduce food waste. Our current programs can make some progress in this area, but it's more on the order of single digits in terms of reductions in food waste. The executive order tasks us with getting to 50%. That is a very tall order. It's not clear how that would occur at this point. And so in talking with our materials management program, what they want to do is really a phase 2 strategic plan effort, working with all the partners to brainstorm about what are the next steps in food waste reduction. And I think that's what we see occurring in this area over the next 12 months, is that sort of effort. We have some limited resources to help in this area from existing funding sources, but not a lot. And at this point, the discussion really is focused on systems changes, education, those sorts of efforts. This is not at this point about regulating what people throw out in their garbage every day, or regulating grocery stores. This is a more open-ended work that we want to do with the partners. There have been efforts in this area that have been underway a little bit longer in some other countries, and we will be looking at those also. But in the United States, Oregon is actually in the forefront in this work that we're doing now with, again, with all the partners. So there's really a discovery effort here to identify what are the next steps, and it's much less defined than some of the next steps for other elements of implementing the executive order. So with that, if there are any questions, I can try and answer them regarding food waste.
Commissioner Kyle?
So I have just a question with regards to food waste, because a few meetings ago, we were also talking about recycling and some of the systems approaches within that program. Is there communication between these to look at that aspect as well?
Sure, George, Commissioner Kyle, there is. So I focused what I spoke to on waste prevention, which is the area where people think there is the largest opportunity for reductions, but there's a whole nother prong, which is recovery, which includes the recycling, composting, those activities. And it's the folks working on that are part of the same program as the folks working on waste prevention. So yes, they are looking at that holistically. If there are no other questions on that, Chair George, the last slide is on timing and resources, and I'll speak briefly to that, and then we will be done with a presentation on this agenda item. As folks know, although the legislature did not take action on policy around greenhouse gas reduction in the last session, they did, through the Legislative Emergency Board, approve $5 million in funding for this work for the rest of this biennium. So we are utilizing those resources along with existing resources to do this work. I'll have to, a little bit of shout out to Colin here. He has been, with help, but really working extremely hard to get this going very quickly. The executive order sets a objective of us bringing recommendations to you for the cap and reduce programs by the end of next year for your action at the end of next year, so that the programs would be starting in early 2022. So that, and there's a lot of steps between where we are now and that endpoint. We are, as Colin has described, anticipating a really extensive public engagement process, including doing some things that we don't normally do. So we are spending some time on talking with representatives from various communities that have been disproportionately affected by changes already in our climate and that are disproportionately affected by air pollution, about how do we engage those communities effectively. We are having conversations with tribal staff about engagement with Oregon's tribes on these efforts. We also are thinking about how to, in the scoping process particularly, set up a workshop format where it is transparent. The conversations that are going on, everybody can see them, but we're also able to really hear from advocates and industry and communities about their ideas. So this scoping period, starting roughly in July and going through roughly November, is going to be very important. We just got through a conversation about COVID and impacts on people. And so we are also thinking about how do we have an effective engagement process when our ability to meet in person is constrained, certainly right now, and likely to continue to be constrained for some time. So I will note, we have had, for this EQC meeting, we have had, my numbers are close to 120 participants in the EQC meeting, which is much more than we've seen at EQC meetings for some time. And I think that's a great thing. So part of what we want to hear from folks over this next 6-week period is ideas about, we're not the only folks who do virtual meetings. We want to hear from everybody about what's the best way to make sure we're hearing from everybody and able to have a back and forth. So we're putting quite a bit of resource into that engagement process. We are going to be contracting with some outside help also to help us with engagement and facilitation. I know there's sensitivity about taking on big policy work like this right now in the middle of the COVID crisis. So part of this is think carefully about the timing. We are going to be starting in July to do the scoping. We're going to do that July through November. We won't even get into rulemaking until very late this year, beginning of next year. Some of how we've set this up is also anticipating that we will be, no one knows exactly where we will be in November, but I think we all hope it'll be a better place than where we are right now, and that at any rate, we will be becoming more skilled in how to use the tools at our disposal to engage effectively. So that a lot of the work going on right now is process work. We're not sitting here figuring out what the recommendations are going to be for EQC a year and a half from now. We're trying to figure out the process part, and that's a lot of our focus right now. I think those were the main things that I wanted to say. So I hope this has been informative both for the commission and the public, because I know there's a lot of interest in this work. And for the public, I just reassure folks that we are going slow in terms of not setting a whole lot of bounds around this work early on, so that we make sure that we do have that effective engagement from all Oregonians in this really important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Yes, Commissioner Addington.
Richard, how do you, I'm not sure quite how to ask, but the process that the department's going through, do you see that being unchanged? I mean, the legislature's going to come back. Are they going to do more related to this program? Do you have any, I know you can't predict that, but do you see this residing with the department for the long term?
Chair George, Commissioner Addington, I really do appreciate that question. I probably should have spoken to this at the end a little bit, so thanks for bringing it up. I have no doubt that the legislature is going to be interested in greenhouse gas reduction, and there will be some in the legislature who introduce and try to move bills on greenhouse gas reduction to try to push particular approaches or stop particular approaches. That's going to happen. It's inevitable, and it's part of it's our democratic process, and I welcome that. At the same time, the way I have asked our folks in our department to approach this work is to ignore that. We have direction, we have existing authority, albeit more, limited, and we have direction on how to use that authority. And so we have work to do to put together a program and present it to you by the end of next year. If the legislature ends up actually doing something, of course we will have to follow that direction. But if we get distracted by that, we're never going to get to having something before you by the end of next year. So I've asked our staff and our managers to really keep focused on the task before us. Let the legislators do their work, and don't get upset by the legislators doing their work, but just keep focused on what our assignment is right now. And if the assignment changes, the assignment changes. I think the work that we're doing is going to be is going to end up getting used in some way or another, even if legislative direction does change. The basic issues of how to put a program in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, in transportation, some things will change around the edges, but if we're serious about getting to the outcomes, we've kind of got to do this work one way or another. And I think to some degree, our work will help the legislature understand some of the details of what it would actually look like. So that's my answer to your question for now.
Thank you. Any other questions on this agenda item? Okay. We know we will be hearing a great deal more as we move forward. So it is now just before 12:30, and we had hoped to take, we probably need to take a break for lunch. We have one more scheduled agenda item for the morning, and it is an action item. And I'm also aware, however, that we have a contested case hearing scheduled for 1 p.m. So Director, what is your advice here? I would imagine that the contested case hearing might be rather time sensitive.
Thank you, Chair George. I think we do want to start the contested case at 1 as it is scheduled. It didn't, strictly speaking, say a time certain, but that has been our practice with contested cases. So I want to try to be respectful of that. We do have the water quality fee increase item. I have a recommendation for the commission on that. Which is in light of some of the discussion we had earlier around the air quality fee increase. I would appreciate the opportunity to set over that agenda item to July and work with staff to make sure that the proposal in that arena reflects some of the conversation we had with regard to the air permit increase. I know we had a particular question from, I think it was Commissioner Kyle, about the overlap between the two. So we can look at that more carefully. I do want, for the record, to note a couple of things about the water quality program fee increase. One, the fee increase is significantly smaller than the fee increase for the air program. And two, the water quality program is under quite a bit more budget pressure than the air program is. And that's because of the nature of the funding and expected shortfalls in revenue that we expect to see in the May revenue forecast. So, but we have the same issues in terms of impacts on fee payers and the economy that we did with regard to the air fee increases. So again, my request to the commission is to set over that agenda item to the July meeting and for us to come back to you with a very carefully refined proposal for the commission.
Okay, do I hear any objection to the director's proposal? No, I appreciate it, Director. I think it's a good suggestion, and we will need to look at that very closely. I think, you know, in our briefings, we do know that the unique situation with our water program and the way they're funded, well, we know that it's a difficult time, and we know that we don't propose fees where we don't think they're needed. So I appreciate that. Let's defer that until our next agenda. And human beings only being able to take so much, I do think we need a break. Stephanie, did I get correct here that we're going to close down our meeting maybe completely during the lunch break? Would you please speak to us about how you want that to be handled?
Thank you, Chair George. This is Stephanie Caldera, Assistant to the Environmental Quality Commission. For the lunch recess, we will close the Zoom meeting to update some settings. We will come back to this meeting. People can dial in or connect by phone or by computer after approximately 12:45. We'll need a few minutes, but then the intent, Chair George, as I understand, is to reconvene with the contested case item that would reconvene at roughly 1 p.m. today.
Very good. All right, everyone. We will reconvene here at just about 1 p.m. And people will either recall back in or just reconnect via the internet. Have a good break, everyone. We'll see you at 1 p.m. We're in recess.